I did speak. I could hear them, but they obviously couldn't hear me, but they obviously can now. So that's good.
Yes,
Thanks.
you're currently unmuted, so we can hear you at the moment. Yes, thank you.
That's fine. That was
Marjorie, it's Geraldine. Can you mute your microphone when you're not speaking? Otherwise, everyone can hear what you're saying.
yes.
Good evening, Mr. Beach. Can you just confirm that you're able to hear and be heard, please?
Yes, I can hear. You would know if I can be heard.
Thank you, Marjorie. But I think I also have a Mr. Beach that has joined. If you're able to confirm that you can hear and be heard, please.
No, I think the microphone wasn't on.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, members. I am Councillor Dennis Spooner, the Chairman of the Planning Committee, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this meeting of the Maidstone Borough Council Planning Committee. Before we commence proceedings, as we always have to do, I have to take this opportunity to advise you that if the fire alarm does sound, please remain seated, and members of the Democratic Services team will assess the situation and give further instructions on the evacuation of the building if necessary. Tonight's proceedings will be webcast by the Council, but if anybody else is intending to record these proceedings, can you please let me know? I ask this question not to stop you, but merely to ensure that members and other members of the public in the room know this is taking place. Nobody is indicating, so I'll take that as a universal no. I would also like to advise members that they should only address the meeting by way of their microphones, and to remind them to turn their microphone off when they have finished speaking. Item 1 on the agenda, apologies for absence. I've received apologies from Councillor Eves, from Councillor Kimmins, and from Councillor Holmes. Are there any other apologies for absence? Have you heard anything from Councillor Mackay? Councillor Mumford,
Councillor Holmes has sent his regards as well. Have you got that?
Are there any substitute members? I can see that I have two. Councillor Springett?
Councillor Springett for Councillor Eves.
And Councillor Mumford? Sorry, Councillor Round.
Councillor Round for Councillor Holmes.
Are there any visiting members here this evening? I can't see any. No? Okay, thank you.
Chairman, sorry, we did have notice that Councillor Russell would be attending this evening to speak on item 14, but she may well be caught up outside.
Okay, yes, I can understand that. Thank you, Miss Snook, for telling me. Moving on to item number 4, items withdrawn from the agenda. Now, 2 applications have been withdrawn, items 16 and 17, and I'll ask Mr. Bailey just to give you a few words about them. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, the applicant withdrew the application, the 2 applications earlier on in the week. They've withdrawn it on the basis of commercial reasons. We have pressed them as to when the applications are likely to be submitted, because as it stands, you would have noted on the papers, the lawful development certificate was recommended for refusal, and as such, there is, as it stands at the moment, a breach of planning control. However, the applicant has indicated that they'll be submitting that application in the new year, resubmitting applications, so either another lawful development certificate or else a planning application. So in this instance, it's in the council's interest to await the outcome of those submission of those applications, and they'll obviously go through the usual process moving forward. But that's why you haven't heard them today, because there's obviously no application to consider tonight, and hence that's why they're withdrawn. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Item number 5 on the agenda is the date of our adjourned meeting, which will be next Thursday, the 25th of November, but I'm very much hoping we will get through the agenda this evening and won't need it. Item 6, urgent items. You have received 2 urgent items which should be on your desks when you arrived. I propose to take these and as verbal updates by the officer, and we will consider them when we consider the items they relate to, which is items 13 and 15. Sorry. Yes. Sorry. Yes, certainly. Mr. Bailey wants to make a comment.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairman. If the item that you've got for the Loddington Lane cottage, that is an unseen item, so members, as I've said to individually to each of you, it wasn't on the website, but that is an item that you wouldn't have seen and hasn't been published, so hence before the presentation of that site, if you want an opportunity to read that unseen urgent update, then it'll be up to the chairman whether he wishes to allow that to occur, but it just contains some important information. So just to let you know on that fact. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Councillor Mumford.
Yeah, I'd like 5 minutes just to read it.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear what you said.
I would like 5 minutes just to read it.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford. Would you like to do that now or before the item? Okay, thank you. Moving on to item 7 on the agenda, are there any disclosures by members and officers? Councillor Mumford.
Yeah, item 13 is situated in Bolton Chelsea. I'm chairman of Bolton Chelsea Parish. However, we have a planning committee, subcommittee, which I do not attend their meetings and have no involvement whatsoever. I intend, therefore, that I'm open-minded to item 13 and intend to vote and speak.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford. That is duly noted. Oh, sorry, Councillor Brindle. Sorry, I didn't notice.
Thank you. I would just like to say item 18 is within my ward. I am a member of Boxley Parish Council. I no longer sit on the Environment Committee, and I propose to talk this evening and vote.
Thank you, Councillor Brindle. That is duly noted. Moving on to item number 8, disclosures of lobbying. If anybody has been lobbied, can they please put their hand up and I will go around the council chamber. Councillor Cox.
Yeah, item 13.
Councillor English, are you?
Item 13.
Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. I've been lobbied on items 13, 15 and 18.
And Councillor Round. I'm sorry. And Councillor Round.
I've been lobbied on item 15.
Councillor Stravinsky. And Councillor Springer.
I've been lobbied via Councillor Eaves passing the information to me for item 18.
Springer. Councillor Perry.
I've been lobbied on item 13 and 15.
Councillor Young. Thank you. And Councillor Brindle.
I've been lobbied on items 13 and 18.
Thank you. And I've been lobbied on items 15 and 18. Now, item number 9. Sorry, have I missed someone out? Oh, sorry.
I've suddenly realised I've been lobbied on 18 as well. It's just it wasn't on the initial list and I've dismissed it, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, can I come back to Councillor Cox then, please, and Councillor Mumford?
Thank you. You're talking about item 18, which is obviously on the agenda that I've had, but on the running order, am I missing something here? Because it says 13, 14, 19 and 15. There is no... I have nothing on the back of it.
What?
Hands up who hasn't got anything on the back.
Sorry.
I thought it was a short evening, but there we are.
Did you put your hand up and not put a back peg?
Well, one didn't know.
So what is it? They haven't got the urgent items?
No, it's just the items on the back page.
Oh.
The one I had missed it.
Oh, I see.
Like on this one, it stops at item 4.
Oh.
So they're just saying, where's the rest?
Oh.
That's all.
Okay, I apologise then. I'm thanking you, Cox and Councillor Cox, and for drawing that to my attention. Thank you. Right, moving on to item 9. To consider whether any items should be taken in private. I move that all items on the agenda be taken in public as proposed. Is everybody happy with that? Great, thank you, members. Item 10, the minutes of our last meeting. I would like to move, unless there are any comments, I would like to move that the minutes of the meeting held on the 21st of October be approved as a correct record and signed. Is that agreed? Thank you, members. Okay, thank you, thank you. Good evening, Councillor Mackay, nice to see you.
My apologies, Mr. Chairman and members, for my tardiness.
Yes, I'm sure there's a very, very good reason. Can I ask if you have any disclosures to make?
None that you'll be interested in, Mr. Chairman.
Have you not been lobbied, Councillor Mackay?
None on the items here that I'm aware of.
Thank you, Councillor Mackay. It's nice to see you here. Moving on to item 11. Presentation of petitions. There are no petitions this evening. We now move on to item 12, deferred items. And as soon as Mr. Bailey gets back to his chair, I'll ask if he can update us on these deferred items. Sorry if I've...
No, thank you, Chairman. I haven't actually got anything to add on those deferred items at this stage.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, Mr. Bailey. In that case, we move on to item 13, which is the first. Item 13, I'm doing that in that order. Where are we? It's item 13, which is the application at Loddington Lane Cottage. And I call upon Mr. Tony Ryan to present.
Did you want to give an opportunity for members to read the urgent updates first before it's presented, or did you want to do them after the presentation?
I was going to do it. Let me ask Councillor Mumford. Councillor Mumford, would you like the 5 minutes now or after the officer's presentation?
I would think that it would put something in context, and so I'd like it now, so when they're listening to the presentation, they can take it into account.
Would you like to raise your hand as soon as you've read sufficient of it? Yeah, okay, thank you. Thank you, Councillor Mumford. Right, without more ado, I'll ask Mr. Ryan to present his report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. This application is for Loddington Lane Cottage. Sorry. The application site is separated from Heath Road, the Heath Road junction, by Rose Cottage, which is just to the north of the red line boundary you can see on the aerial photograph. To the south and west of the site is woodland. The proposal site is located within the designated countryside and the Greensand Ridge landscape of local value. The site is within Linton Conservation Area, an area of archaeological potential, KCC mineral safeguarding area, and in flood zone 1. The application site currently consists of an existing two-storey house and its rear and side garden land. This is the first of 4 photographs. This is looking north along the lane towards the site. The application site is on the left-hand side, just visible where the van is parked. The woodland to the south of the application site is visible in the picture foreground. The second photograph is looking from the opposite direction, looking south from the junction with Heath Road. The application site is located on the right-hand side in the middle of the picture, with Rose Cottage in the foreground on the actual junction. This third photograph is from the rear of the site, showing the present buildings. The single-storey pitched roof outbuilding on the left-hand side will be knocked down to make way for the new dwelling. And just further round, the outbuilding is visible on the right-hand side of this photograph. And on the left-hand side, you can see the rear of Rose Cottage. Going on to the plans, the building on the application site at the moment was originally built as a pair of semi-detached houses. In recent years, the 2 houses have been used as a single dwelling and rented out to farm workers employed by the owners. The current application involves restoring the existing building back into 2 dwellings with a 2-storey rear and side extension to provide 1 2-bedroom and 1 3-bedroom dwelling. The proposal also includes the construction of a new 4-bedroom detached dwelling on garden land to the north of the existing building. The existing detached outbuilding, which was visible in the photograph, will be knocked down as part of the scheme. If you can see on this drawing, the outline of the existing building is shown in a dashed line. A driveway between the extended existing building and the new building will actually provide access to off-street parking at the rear of the site. The existing hedge across the part of the garden land will be retained and replanted where necessary. These show the floor plans of the existing proposed building. On the left-hand side, you have the existing building, showing the ground floor and the first floor layout. On the right-hand side, you've got the new building. it is highlighted that all of the proposed windows on the new build dwelling that face towards the neighbour at Rose Cottage will be bathrooms, kitchens and toilets. The applicant has stated that all the bathroom and toilet windows will be fitted with obscured glazing, which includes all of the windows at first floor level. In terms of the external appearance of the buildings, this building shows the existing extended buildings on the left-hand side and the new build on the right-hand side of this drawing. The roof will be natural slate to both buildings. The windows and doors will be aluminium clad with either an off-white or grey finish. The existing building will have a render finish, and the new building will have red-brown tile hanging with red stock brickwork. In summary, members' attention is drawn to the urgent update published earlier this week and to the previously unseen update circulated this evening, which includes a recommendation that planning permission is granted subject to no new comments from a press notice. That press notice is required because this application is considered a departure from the neighbourhood plan. Planning law sets out that planning applications should be determined in accordance with the local plan, which includes a neighbourhood plan, unless there are material factors which indicate otherwise. It is accepted by officers that the submitted proposal is contrary to policies RH1 and PWP4 of the neighbourhood plan. However, it's considered that the proposal relating to an existing house and a new dwelling on its garden land, which is with a new dwelling between existing buildings, would not result in unacceptable harm to the character and appearance of the area. The site is also not in an unsustainable location. The proposal is in accordance with the latest version of the NPPF that was published in July 2021 and in accordance with all the other relevant policies within the local plan and the neighbourhood plan as set out in the officer report. With all these factors taken into account, the proposal is considered acceptable in planning terms and the application is recommended for approval on this basis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ryan. We have three public speakers this evening, Mr. Beach, Councillor Room and Mr. Latham. Could I ask Mr. Beach if he'd like to speak to us first? I understand he's speaking to us remotely. Are you able to hear us?
Yes, I can hear proceedings. Is it clear at your end as well?
I can just about hear you.
Hello, is it clear at your end as well?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can other members hear? Yes, we can all hear you. Yes.
Oh, okay. Right. Okay. Being direct neighbours to the above property, we'd be highly affected by overshadowing loss of light to our property. The development will be very close to the south of our house, reducing light and sun to 4 rooms, as well as our garden. Our patio, the only part of our garden which is usable due to the high level of noise on the Heath Road on the other side, will be completely overshadowed and transformed into a dark tunnel. Our privacy would be severely undermined with the garden being overlooked, and the outlook and character will be dramatically changed from open countryside to looking direct into a large brick wall. We're also very concerned about building in a conservation area and in the Greensand Ridge landscape of local value, and the harm it would do to those areas. According to the neighbourhood plan, no development should take place to the south of Heath Road to keep the rural appearance intact. The new development would also create parking spaces in a large part of the garden immediately adjacent to the woods and within the conservation area. This would be a very unpleasant sight in a presently green space, as well as create noise and pollution. At least one big willow tree would have to be removed, and a long-standing hedge recognised as a feature would have to be probably removed and replanted. The multi-stemmed willow tree has been coppiced within the last few years, with the stools still being present. We're objecting to the bulk and size of the planned development as well. We have no objection to developing the presently existing house, but the planned infill would severely affect our environment, privacy and character of our house and garden, changing the outlook dramatically from open countryside to a brick wall, making us overshadowed and overlooked. Loddington Lane is a quiet, single track country lane, the nature of which would be substantially changed by the proposed development, and the increased traffic, exhaust fumes and noise of at least 6 cars would be significant. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Beach. Well within your 3 minutes. Our second public speaker is Councillor Room, I think that's how it's pronounced, from Bolton Monchelsea Parish Council, who is with us remotely. Can you hear us, Councillor?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you. I'm not certain whether it's very clear yet. Can you speak again?
Yes. Is this any better?
Yes, I think we can hear that. Thank you. Would you like to start? You have 3 minutes.
Yes, thank you. I have 3 points to make on behalf of Bolton Monchelsea Parish Council on the proposal for the new detached dwelling. The first point is on location. Our neighbourhood policy RH1 states that new residential development to the south of Heath Road will not be supported unless it conforms with national and local rural exception policies. This policy RH1 is underpinned by evidence contained in the in-depth landscape assessment in the NHP, and the examiner found policy RH1 to be compliant with NBC's strategy. The site is located in an LLV conservation area and abuts both the nationally recognised parkland and the NHP's priority landscape. This development is detrimental to the surrounding protected areas, as well as being contrary to RH1, SP17 and DM30. In addition, it cannot be considered infilling, as the application declares, and neither conserves nor enhances the landscape. Rather, it would add bulk and ribbon development to Loddington Lane. Contrary to NHP policy PWP4, this proposal is not an identified housing need, not supporting a heritage asset, not in the development boundary, and not supported by policy RH1. Contrary to RH8, the proposal would negatively impact the open countryside in that it is not innovative, is not architecturally outstanding, does not enhance its immediate surroundings, and is not sensitive to the local area. My second point is on loss of neighbour amenity, where the report states that it is considered that the proposal would not appear overbearing or result in an unacceptable loss of light and outlook for the occupants of Rose Cottage when trying to enjoy their property. We submit that neighbourhood amenity would in fact be severely impacted, as the north-facing wall of the proposed two-storey dwelling would extend the full length of Rose Cottage, impacting on both light and outlook. The assumption by officers that all the rooms in Rose Cottage have dual aspect windows is incorrect, and the upper window on the western elevation would also overlook the complete garden area of Rose Cottage, affording it no privacy. The report states the condition will be imposed to ensure the first floor openings on the northern elevation are obscure glazed and fixed shut, except for a fan light. If this has to be conditioned, then surely the proposal is creating unacceptable overlooking.
Can I stop you there,
obscure
please,
glazing
Councillor?
in rooms other than bathrooms is
Can I stop you there,
an
Councillor?
unacceptable condition.
You had your 3 minutes. I'm
We
sorry.
ask whether a light assessment has been carried out.
Okay. Thank you very much, Councillor Room.
My third point is on conservation issues. The proposal is immediately adjacent to the Linton Conservation Area. The conservation officer commented previously that there was insufficient illustration the proposal would be a positive contribution to this conservation area. We share these concerns and feel that the proposal would...
Are you able to, can you hear me, Councillor Room? Oh, right, he's been guillotined. Thank you very much. Thank you. I don't know whether you...
I'm sorry.
I don't know whether Councillor Room can still hear me, but I do apologise. We had his 3 minutes, I had to cut him off. Our third...
Okay, very good. Fine, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, bye.
Okay, our third public speaker, who I'm pleased to actually hear, Mr. Latham, who is here in person. And if you're not aware by now, I'm sure you are, it's 3 minutes. Yes, please, if you press the button in the middle, and from when you press the button, you have 3 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Simon Latham from Design and Build Services, and I represent the applicant in this matter. Basically, as you've already heard, this application involves the conversion, extension of an existing dwelling into 2 residential units and the construction of a new detached 2-storey dwelling in the garden land in between Rose Cottage and the existing cottage. In September 2020, we submitted a pre-application advice request to the council and worked with the council officer, planning officer and the conservation officer, taking into account their advice to produce a scheme which we believe is suitable to this site and reduces the impact from previous applications and is the most suitable, has the least impact on the neighbour as possible. The design, as I said, retains the existing cottage, which historically was originally 2 cottages, and we have designed a 2-bedroom and a 3-bedroom unit within that. The new house on an infill plot in garden land, not in open countryside, will be used natural materials and a good design and good spatial awareness around the property. There's an existing drive will be extended, and parking and bin enclosure areas will be at the rear of the site. The planning officer and the conservation officer support this application. And there are no objections from the highways or any other consultees other than the parish council. Parking provision at the rear will help keep the road free at the front, and bins will not be in an unsightly position at the front of the property. We have carried out an ecological study of the site, and we will work with Kaluma Ecology and SWAT Archaeology if the application is approved, to ensure that all the conditions that are attached to any approval will be complied with. The Conservation Office has said that this scheme could have a positive impact on the conservation area. Regarding the overlooking, we have ensured that the neighbour is not overlooked in any way, and we understand that he has windows on the ground floor of his property and one on the first floor. Obviously, in planning terms, there is no right to a view over your neighbour's garden, and we have made every effort to push the new house away from his property, and it is almost 8 metres from the windows of his property. The site will, the housing on the site will provide a good variation, 2, 3 and 4 bedrooms for starter homes. The houses will be offered for sale in the open market.
I'm afraid that's your 3 minutes, Mr. Latham. I'm sorry.
No worries.
But I have to be fair to everybody.
No, that's fine.
But thank you very much for your presentation. Right, councillors, we've had 3 very good presentations from the public. Like to go to the local member, Councillor Mumford.
Yeah, excuse me if I haven't got my act quite together tonight. I've had a lot going on. Some corrections. The site is in the open countryside. Most definitely is in the open countryside, contrary to what was just said. And also, as you'll see in your report, it's 4 metres away from Rose Cottage. Dealing with the update, I'd like to say the sustainability question of buses is a bit confusing in there, so I'll tell you what it is. It is 1 school bus per school day goes to that stop and in the evening, one school bus comes home. I would have to check it, but I don't even think the public can use it unless they're going to school. There is no Sunday service at all, no weekend service at that stop. Within the village, there is no Sunday service, and there is no direct bus link from Bolton-on-Chelsea to Maidstone. So just to bring that in context, I am so pleased that they now acknowledge the landscape assessment, and we can now deal with this as type 34, which is same as Greensand Ridge. I'll come on to that. The diagrams are a bit clumsy, but any parish puts together a neighbourhood plan, and it's all designed so they can decide where development goes and how to shape it. The basis of Bolton-on-Chelsea's neighbourhood plan was based on landscape. And even though they talk about RH1, that does not permit any development south of Heath Road, what it admits to say that RH1 also allows development across the parish. That is only one element of RH1. And so far, because we've got urban edge in this local plan, we've provided, and in the neighbourhood plan, there's over, Bolton has provided about 1,400 houses. So it's not a restricted policy. Its evidence base is its landscape assessment, which went on for a long time, very expensive, and the policies were drawn from that. The location, no, it's not an AONB, however, we have applied for that status for that area. The site abuts Linton Park, which is a registered park, which is a national landscape designation. It's in the Linton Conservation Area, which we're required to conserve and enhance, and there's a statutory requirement for that. It is on the Greensand Ridge land of local value, which is conserve and enhance, we're required to do. And the neighbourhood plan on the landscape assessment is now accepted that it's 34 instead of 29. What that means is now different to your report. We must conserve its high overall landscape sensitivity. Within that, you are to conserve the undeveloped character of the landscape and avoid linear infill development. That is a requirement of that. So if we start with the one that is statutory, conserve and enhance. Well, this does not enhance the Linton Conservation Area. That is one thing that we can say. Does it conserve it? So we're looking at the actual site. The conservation area, an officer talks about a neutral contribution, and I would agree with that. What is there at the moment is a neutral contribution, but we're not looking for that. We're looking for enhancing it or conserving it. Across the Greensand Ridge, we have agriculture, we have fields, agricultural land, we have woodland, we have coppice land, and it's quite diverse. But what it is very open. And if there are dwellings out there, they're individual dwellings with space and openness. Even where we get a collection of houses, there's space between them. That is the character of the landscape. One of the views on our landscape assessment, one of the important views, is directly down at this site. And it shows that what it is the boundary between developed area and the rural countryside. And there it says, avoid development down Loddington Lane. And it shows a view of this site. So why I'm looking now at the site, does it conserve it? Well, we've got the opennesses taken away. I've got a picture. Yeah. And the instructions there is to conserve it. That's your site. And it says on our landscape, don't allow development down Loddington Lane. And there's a picture of it. Right. If I look at the site, it's not open. We're building on their gardens. And so I'm saying it's not characteristic. It's not the characteristic landscape that we see and the open feel of the countryside. The setting's cramped, uncharacteristic, and if you consider the parking at the back with, I think it's 7 vehicles along the Linton Park gardens, I think that it's going to look very industrial. So I would like to resist this, that it's a cramped site. It is contrary to RH1, which says that new residential development south of Parish Road will not be supported unless it conforms with national or local rural exception sites. The neighbourhood plan does allow development in the open countryside, but it has to be outstanding on things like architecture, innovation, and it must not affect the character of the open countryside. This is linear development, ribbon development down a country lane and will start forming a... It is the distinct link between the developed area, the undeveloped area. Neighbours' amenity, I'm nearly finished. That north-facing wall goes all the way along Rose Cottage. The living accommodation is at the bottom, obviously on the lower floor of Rose Cottage. You will not be able to see the sky from the windows. It will vastly affect the enjoyment of and the amenity of Rose Cottage. And there is one window that faces west on the first story of the new build, which will overlook their garden. It doesn't matter how much screening, unless you're going to grow big leylandis there, will give them privacy. So I would like to propose that this is unacceptable and it is contrary to R1 and SP17. I would also include in that it's unacceptable because of the neighbour amenity on Rose Cottage. I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford. Do you have a seconder for your... Councillor English?
I was always under the impression that neighbourhood plans form part of the development plan and that planning applications should be determined in accordance with the development plan unless material circumstances mitigated otherwise. Well, I think it's fairly clear that Portmore-on-Chelsea's neighbourhood plan is part of the development plan and that this application doesn't comply with it. So what I'm asking myself is, what are the mitigating circumstances that have been put forward to say that we should approve it? Well, it appears, at least from the report, that a lot of those mitigating circumstances are actually in dispute. For a start, the neighbourhood amenity issue is played down by the fact that the report argues that they have windows on both sides of the ground floor rooms. Well, actually, that's highly debatable, and the ward member has said that's not true. I'm a little surprised to hear that this was 2 buildings, because I'm fairly certain that within Councillor Mumford's lifetime it hasn't been. So I would be interested to know where the evidence for that comes from. But because we had the ward member was telling me earlier that within his lifetime this had never been the case. Even if the amenity issue doesn't arise, which it may not do, what we have here is something which is contrary to policy, and I have not heard an argument for why we should set aside that policy. There should be a strong argument as to why we're approving development in an area of some sensitivity if we're going to go against the development plan, of which the neighbourhood plan is a part. And I have not heard that compelling argument. We should have that. We need a bit more than it's okay, maybe, and it's not too bad. That doesn't represent an argument for going against the development plan. We need a bit better than that. If we were going to approve an application against the development plan, we should have as strong arguments as we have in turning down an application against the development plan. It's still an overturn of the plan, and we should have strong arguments on both cases. If we were refusing an application against the plan, we would be asking for a strong justification. That should apply when we're actually looking to approve something against the plan too. I have not heard a strong argument for why we should set it aside, and I'd like to hear one.
Thank you, Councillor English. Before we hear from Councillor Harwood, can I bring back to Mr Bailey?
I think it's a relevant point that Councillor English raises on that point. And I think if I can address it as succinctly as I can, RH1 policy is very clear in what it intends to say, i.e. development to the south is to be resisted, development to the north is acceptable within the village boundaries. So it sets a context in terms of where development is to go in that village. Similarly, where we've made justifications on SP17, it's a 2-step policy. Now, it's okay in the policy to direct where development should go, but in the same instance, you also have to show when you're directing that development where the harm is arising from development going to the south. So it's fine in the neighbourhood plan to say no development to the south, but then what we need to consider as officers and advise you is to say, okay, we've got an application that is in the south. The application has been advertised as a departure because it's clearly a departure from PWP4 and it's a departure from RH1, so that's very clear. But what you have to determine in this context is, acknowledging that point, where is the harm? Now, this report tries to articulate that, and I appreciate that may not be the consensus of certain members in the room, and I appreciate that, but the officer has concluded on her professional view that she doesn't consider that there's actually harm to the character and appearance of the countryside. You are entitled to reach a different view, just as well you're entitled to reach a different view in terms of conservation area issues. You've heard the ward member say the site has a characteristics of open. You have a duty, and this is a statutory duty, to conserve or enhance the character or appearance of conservation areas. That is a statutory duty. The duty under the landscape of local importance is a local consideration, but it's not a statutory duty. It's a duty under the determination of the development plan. So you're quite clearly can come to a contrary view of both the conservation officer and of the officer that's made the assessment of the report. But I think it was important, because Councillor English raised a very good point, that there wasn't a sort of a justification for departing, and hopefully what I said is the officer has concluded that there isn't that harm to the character and appearance of the conservation area, there isn't that harm to the countryside, and hence that's why the recommendation to approve has come forward, but acknowledging that it is a departure from the neighbourhood plan. And the important part of the urgent update is because you've got two policies, RH1 and PWP4, that it departs against. So hopefully that gives members a clarification on the points that we're considering.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Right, I have Councillor Harwood next.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll try not to repeat all the points that were very eloquently made by the ward councillor and the additional point from Councillor English, and try and confine my comments to the motion. For the reasons that Mr. Bailey has set out, I think we will have to clarify further why our view is contrary to the officers, perhaps, in our judgment on the relative landscape impact and harm. And I think there's a couple of really important points. I think one point really does link back to Councillor English's, that the Bolton-on-Chelsea Neighbourhood Plan is actually a more up-to-date document than the landscape character documents that support our local plan. And the assessment is more thorough for this site. And that Bolton-on-Chelsea landscape assessment, it really does emphasise the importance of openness. And I think that comes on to a critical point, is that Mr. Bailey described kind of setting a context when he was talking about development south of Heath Road compared to north when you get into the open countryside. I think actually that the junction of Loddington Lane sets the context for that lane as you head south. And I think it's really important that we preserve that openness. And I think the spaces between buildings are fundamental in doing that. The glimpse of the woodland with the big parkland trees and so on to the rear within the grounds of Bolton-on-Chelsea Place, I think are really important. And if you create any terracing effect, which is inevitable with this proposal, it does erode that openness. I think there's also an issue around the layout that's proposed, and if we do end up in an appeal situation, I want to be sure that we pick up all the key points. And I think the point that Councillor Mumford made right at the end of his speech about the impact of the parking at the rear of the property is a really important one, because those 7 parking spaces up against the close boarded fence at the back of the site, you know, without, you know, kind of saying anything kind of unpleasant about some of the urban wards, it looks more like what you would do with parking in an inner urban ward than in open countryside, cheek by jowl, with a nationally designated historic park and woodland with ancient woodland in its heart. I realise that the outer edge that links onto it as an ancient woodland, but if you just point to the southeast from this garden, it becomes ancient woodland in the middle of that wood. And effectively, through creating that car parking area at the back of the property, you are creating an urban barrier between that hamlet, if you like, and the historic parkland. And I think it's perhaps important that we talk about that, because I would not want an inspector to miss that if he was setting down parameters for any future development, which would probably be a conversion or even a redevelopment of the existing unit. I think that is probably the key issues, but I just do think that we do need to put greater detail in if we are to properly explain why we are at variance with the officer's recommendation. Thank you.
Thank
my part, I'm happy to take on board Councillor Harwood's suggestions.
Thank you, Councillor English. Before I go to Councillors Perry and Spring, I'd just like to ask a question of Mr. Bailey myself, and that the order papers do identify the fact that a previous application was refused solely on the grounds that it didn't provide enough protection for protected species. And I just wonder if you could perhaps comment on the implications that have for any decision the council might make this evening.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I'll take you through the simple terms of it. Obviously, that was an officer-delegated decision. For the sake of consistency, then there is an expectation that the decisions are taken in accordance with the development plan, and obviously they're taken on a consistent basis. So in normal circumstances, if an application was refused on one particular ground, then that's telling the applicant that everything else is acceptable, but if you were to come back with a resubmitted application, you'd need to address this particular ground. So on that basis, you would be expecting this application to deal with biodiversity matters, and by implication, all the other matters are considered acceptable. Members are entitled to depart and make a different decision, but they have to be very clear what the reasons for that different decision are. And I have to say that in that implication, on appeal, if the application is refused, it does open up a potential cost ground for unreasonable behaviour. And I mean unreasonable behaviour not on the part of the committee, but because the applicant, you're introducing a new ground or additional grounds of refusal that weren't previously added to that previous ground of refusal. So it opens up a potential cost ward, and I say potential cost ward for unreasonable behaviour, but it doesn't stop members reaching a different decision as long as you apply material weight. It is a material consideration that that application was refused just on that ground. Does that answer your question?
Thank
and
you.
Maybe on that point, if the legal officer's got anything further to add on that point, maybe if we bring him in now.
Yeah, thank you, James. I agree with what James has said. What it just basically says is that you may depart from an existing decision if there are rational reasons for doing so, and those reasons should be briefly explained. So, yeah, you've got a previous decision, and I suspect that if you've got rational reasons, that may overcome any cost application that could be made.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. Councillor Mumford, would you just like to come back quickly before I go to other councillors?
On that point, the Bournemouth-Chelsea neighbourhood plan didn't carry full weight when the other decision was made.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford, and thank you, Mr. Bailey and Mr. Fitzpatrick, for your lucid explanations of the situation we're in. Councillor Perry, I have now next.
Thank you. I understand James's point and Russell's as well, but I don't buy it actually, because the point just made by Councillor Mumford is absolutely right. The status of the neighbourhood plan is now much higher. So, and I want to come back to that particular point. But I just wanted to say I agree entirely 100% with what Councillor Mumford, Councillor English and Councillor Harwood have said. I absolutely agree, and I think the point about being more up to date is a very, very powerful one as well, and it ties in the whole issue of the neighbourhood plan. So I'm not going to repeat everything that's been said, because I think, you know, it has been said and it's been very well said. But I do want to make a point about the importance of neighbourhood plans. A huge amount of work has gone into the Bournemouth-Montressy neighbourhood plan. I know that, and I've known it from my own experience with the Staplehurst neighbourhood plan. These are very important, and they need to be taken into consideration. And when I read this report, and by the way, it covers not just the biodiversity bit, it actually covers, it's a whole new report as far as I read it, so I don't really buy the point made, I'm sorry, by James Bailey or by Russell Fitzpatrick on this one, because to me, I read it as a completely new report, and you've got a new and an up-to-date neighbourhood plan, and the neighbourhood plan is incredibly important. And I think the policies in that neighbourhood plan must be taken and given a huge amount of weight. But when I read this paper, it didn't really give a lot of weight to policy RH1. It seemed to be tacked on at the end as a kind of afterthought. Oh, well, we need to consider the neighbourhood plan. I'm sorry, I don't buy that. And perhaps I'm speaking with a parish hat on as well as a borough councillor's hat. This is very, very important. And so I totally support what has been proposed. And if it hadn't been seconded, I would be most happy to have seconded it myself. But you have my support, because I think the points made have been very powerfully made. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Perry. Councillor Springett and then Councillor Round.
Thank you. I hate gardens being built on, basically. It's residential garden land as well, and I don't like building in gardens. So that's just a bee I have in my bonnet. It's got a lot going for it. It contravenes the neighbourhood plan. It's in the landscape of local value. It's in a conservation area. I'm sorry, I don't consider a school bus once out and once back a day to make somewhere sustainable. I think that's absolutely ridiculous. And the bus stop round the corner on a day when it's tipping it with rain, you're either going to drive to the bus stop, in which case once you're in your car you might as well carry on. I just fail to see how that is sustainable. We've got a 5-year land supply. That's supposed to be a big deciding factor. 8 metres between the properties. I used to back onto a field with sheep and horses. I now have houses that overlook me. There are 23 metres between me and those houses, and I am deeply upset by my loss of privacy, as are my neighbours are. We are deeply offended with 23 metres between us because we're overlooked. I absolutely get the upset of the neighbour. We may not lose light, but he will, and I don't think we should disregard that. We have a 5-year land supply. It's contrary to the neighbourhood plan, and we're told they're part of the policy and we should support them. So I support what Councillor Mumford has said. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Springett. I now have Councillor Round and then Councillor Stubinski.
Thank you, Chair. To be perfectly honest, most of it's actually been said, and all that needs to be said has been said, quite frankly. But I would say that I'm sitting here with my fellow co-board member as well, where we've had fairly similar applications where an old dump of a wreck sits in a site and is obviously a development potential. And on the basis of both SP17 and DM30, this council has turned down those applications. And yet here we are trying to approve this one. I'm sorry, I need to see consistency. This is not consistency. So therefore, this should be refused.
Thank you, Councillor Round. Councillor Stubinski.
Yeah, I just support what Martin said, really, and I think we do need to be consistent on this, and that's the main point.
Thank you. Can I ask Mr. Bailey to wrap up, I think is the expression we use?
Yeah, I can see where this is potentially heading down to. So I just want to get some structure in terms of how a potential ground of refusal would look. I think first of all, we need to establish in terms of, are we objecting on conservation area terms? Are we objecting in terms of the Green Sand Ridge terms, failing to conserve or enhance? That then takes you, if you are objecting on those issues and you're demonstrating harm, then obviously then that comes down into other conflicts, both with the neighbourhood plan, because that's the heritage asset, the conservation area, and there are other policies in the neighbourhood plan and in the local plan which would then follow through in terms of a potential ground of refusal. So I think what we need to do is just to get some structure in terms of what that ground looks like, because if you do say it doesn't conserve or enhance and it's harmful, then that triggers potentially a harmful issue on the Greensand Ridge, then that triggers its harm to the countryside, then that triggers and flows through that it's contrary to RH1 and PWP4 on that basis. So you're structuring your grounds, and on that basis you then bring in the SP17 policy, you bring in the SP17, I think it is, in terms of the local plan, you bring in SP18, you bring in DM1, you bring in DM4, which are all heritage asset issues, if you see what I mean. So you just need to make sure that we're logically adding all those grounds together and constructing them. So I just need some clarity how that's going to come forward, and then if we are, then I would ask for a slight a bit of time while I draft that up, and then if members give me that direction, I can come up for a slight 5-minute adjournment and we'll draft that up. Does that give members an idea of where we're heading?
Being adjourning for 5
Councillor
minutes would be
Harwood?
good.
Yeah, sorry, I understand that colleagues are individually looking at wording, and I've been coming up with something. But Mr. Bailey did not mention the point around the proposal to cover the entire of the rear of the property with car parking. And that is hard onto the boundary of the historic park and garden, which is a strong designation. And also, the initial reason for refusal was impact on biodiversity, potentially, or they had not been accommodated. My contention is, by creating a parking area, which will presumably have vehicles either parked on it or driving over it the whole time, or having headlights on, that creates an absolute barrier between habitats. And I think that is a point which is quite a fundamental and important one, which needs to be captured as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Harwood. Mr. Bailey?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think what we would encapsulate that is if members conclude that it's harmful and fails to conserve or enhance the character and appearance of the conservation area, that brings into the loss of the garden area, the loss of the open space, the extent of the hard standing to the rear part of the site, which would be visible from the road. So you could bring in all those harms to the conservation area, because that is your statutory clue. So depending how detailed your ground of refusal wants to be, we could include those in terms of harm. It's just leaving you giving direction in terms of what you want to include in that. But my point is just to get the structure flowing through a ground of refusal to demonstrating harm, and then that ticks all the other boxes in the policies that you want to get through. Because I need a very clear line on what policies we're going to use. And obviously added on to that, if you want the grounds of refusal in relating to the unneighbourly form of development, which you said, which was probably overpowering and unneighbourly, would be sort of a second ground if you want to sort of take that further forward. Yeah. Well, members need to vote on it and see what they want to do. So,
right.
We need to sort of give that's what they want.
Okay. Right, Councillor Mumford, you proposed refusal. It's been seconded. We'll make a decision, and then perhaps we may need a break just to get the reasons for refusal agreed. Is that okay with you? Okay, well, the basic structure, yeah.
No, if we adjourn now for 5 minutes, we'll come back with it all. We'll speak to Mr. Bailey, and we will come up with the detailed proposal. So if you take five...
We should get the reasons before we...
We get the reasons, and then the members will know the reasons that they're voting on.
Okay, you happy with that? Yeah, that's really well. Yeah. Okay, that is fine. So if we stop now for 5 minutes. Thank you. take your seats, please, members? Councillor Round, Councillor Mackay.
So just once the thing's been out, I'll just say to Jen, very comfortable to be able to defend it.
Okay, so you want me to say you want...
Yeah, that I just want to check he's comfortable with what is being proposed, right, because it's from members, not from James.
And then you want me to ask you?
Yeah, I'll come in when I think. Right.
Thank you, members. I'll ask Mr. Bailey to read out the reasons for refusal which he thinks might be appropriate in this particular case, and then we will go to the vote.
Thank you, Chairman. So what we have is the proposal will result in an intensification and loss of open space between buildings at the focal point, the northern end of Loddington Lane, and would result in clear harm to the functioning of the conservation area. The proposed built form and layout is uncharacteristic of and undermines the openness and rhythm and distinctly rural nature of this part of the Greensand Ridge. The proposed parking court covering the width of the rear of the site would introduce a jarring and urbanising feature immediately adjacent to a designated historic park and garden, that's the Linton Park, which causes harm to its character and the conservation area. The proposal would result in ribbon development, compromising important open spaces and views through the existing developed area, causing harm to the character and appearance of the countryside hereabouts. The proposed car parking court will divorce the application site from the adjacent woodland and result in a negative impact upon local biodiversity by virtue of habitat fragmentation and disturbance. The proposal would result in an unneighbourly form of development which will have an overpowering and unneighbourly form of development principally on Rose Cottage. And then what I would request, because if I just set out the policies that I'm going to refer to, but I'd need to structure those in the relevant parts of that section. So the policies that we're going to use are RH1. Now, what I should add in that, no mention has been made in that of the actual design. And I'll just ask members why go through the policies, because that was mentioned by Councillor Mumford. There is no mention in the ground of any design issue. It's about harm to the character and appearance of the countryside. So if I leave that one with you just to consider if you're satisfied with the design of the buildings that's come forward, but the policies that we would use based on the current grounds are RH1, PWP4. We'd need to consider whether we use RH6 and RH8 depending on, this is all of the neighbourhood plan, depending whether you look at the design matter. And then also when we move to the local plan, we would look at policies SS1, SP17, SP18, DM1 and DM4. So those are the policies that would be saying contrary, but I've just asked members just to clarify the design matter. Are they satisfied just to leave the grounds as we've got? Or was design of the individual units of concern?
Councillor Mumford.
Within the neighbourhood plan, and as I say, some of the members will understand why I'm a bit disorganised tonight. Within the neighbourhood plan, Mr. Bailey, there is a policy that allows for innovative design, high architecture, etc. And that's what we're looking for in the countryside, and it's one of the policies. I remember the 8, and I think it is. It's what? RH6, is it? Yeah. So if it was allowed, it would have to comply with RH6, and because it doesn't comply with RH6, we can go down that direction.
I'm asking members is designed forming a ground, and then if it is, then I'll use the relevant policies of the neighbourhood plan to address that point. So I just think I'm asking, are you satisfied with the design, the actual design of the units, or are you raising an issue with them?
No, I think the converted building, you could do very little with the design without taking it completely out of character, and the other one is a bog standard design of, yeah, no, go on, no.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford. I think that's, okay, so you're satisfied with the grounds that we have. Can I ask Mr Fitzpatrick if he has any comments from the legal point of view?
Yeah, just a quick one. James, on the PWP, obviously there's two steps to that. One is in line with policies RH1 and RH6, blah, blah, and then there are three. There's results in significant benefits to the parish, and I presume we're just saying none of those other provisions apply here, because I'm not sure that that's captured in your grounds.
I think on that point that we've got sufficient grounds to say it be contrary to PWP4, and in the any subsequent appeal that would come forward, we would have to argue that point, you know, point by point as it goes through that system. So I think by saying it's contrary to PWP4, that is sufficient. I'm satisfied on that basis. Yes.
Thank you, Mr Bailey and Mr Fitzpatrick. You have a proposition before you that's been seconded. Can I have your votes, please, in favour of the proposition by Councillor Mumford? Votes against? There wasn't any, were there? Oh, yes. Right, thank you, members. That permission is refused. Thank you. Right, we now move on to item number 14 on the agenda. The Pack Horse, Queen Street, Paddock Wood, Kent. And I'll call upon Mr Bailey, our Development Manager, to introduce his report.
Thank you, Chairman. This is an outline application for proposed development of the site with light industrial storage business units and associated facilities. The only matter for consideration tonight is access being sought, all other matters reserved for future consideration. I would suggest at the start of the presentation an amendment to condition 3 on the basis, given the wide-ranging nature of the description of development, and condition 3 seeks to put some parameters around this application, I would suggest an addition to that condition to add a floor area limitation of no more than 345 square metres. Now, that comes from the illustrative proposal, and the officer considers that illustrative proposal is acceptable. It's obviously down to members, but I think this adds an element and a degree of control over the floor space of this outline permission. Otherwise, you could come back with a reserve matters application and find the floor space to be much bigger than the illustrative plan shows you. So I think that additional condition adds some element of control if members found this application acceptable. So turning to the details of the application, just going through the brief history of the site. The site had a previous lawful permission for B8, B1 and B8 under permissions in 2001 and 05, and also had a B2, B8 permission granted for a lawful development certificate in 2006. But obviously, as the report sets out, the building was destroyed by fire in 2016. Obviously, you'll note in your papers, page 27 of your papers, an application for much larger units came before this committee in 2017 on the 19th of December, and that application was deferred for those items set out in those bullet points, which I won't repeat now. It's also helpful on page 29 of your papers, which sets out the size of the building through that application, and then you can see to the right of that, you can see the existing or the current proposed, albeit being illustrative, that is what is being proposed currently. So as I said, the only matters for consideration tonight are the access proposals, and I'll just go through the plans now. So this is the application site. You have Queen Street, you have residential properties down to the south down here. This is a shared access drive leading down to properties further down this access road. This is the application site here. So this is an aerial photograph of the site. You can see the other residential properties to the north of the site and to the south of the site. So obviously, after the fire in 2016, the site was cleared. The officer has given weight to the previous use of the site, and as I said, it's set out what the size of that building was on the previous application on page 29 of your papers. So this is a view of the eastern boundary of the site, where we've got Queen Street running around the corner here, and this is the shared access drive with the site going into the site just off here, and this is the shared access drive with the properties off to the right-hand side. This is a view looking south along the southern boundary, so this is the southern boundary of the site. The site is over here, the residential property, and that does provide quite a substantial screening to the front of the site. It is proposed, as illustratively shown, that the buildings will be positioned towards the back of the site, but again, I'm just letting members know that is for illustrative purposes only at this stage. So this is what's proposed as an illustrative detail. You've got the building and the dimensions of that building, again, illustratively, are set out on page 29. So you've got quite a detailed assessment on 2.02 to 2.05, setting out the various sizes of the original building compared to what's currently proposed. Car parking spaces here. The officer's report does allude to the rather extensive area of hard standing up to here to the front, but as I say, this is for illustrative purposes only at this stage, and a further reserved matters application will have to come forward with layout, which would also include landscaping to deal with the actual internal layout of the site. So this is slightly proposed, slightly further detail. As I said, concern has been raised in the report to this illustrative hard standing area, but as I said, that is not for consideration at this time. It's really the principle of light industrial uses on this site arising from the scheme. And then this again is illustrative detail. Also it sets out in the report what the maximum height or what this illustrative proposal shows, and members will note that also the condition that I've requested to be amended also puts a limitation on maximum height for buildings, which says a total height of no more than 7 metres on the application site. So again, that's a parameter to control the impact on the surrounding landscape. So the key issues to consider, I won't go over them, are set out in the report, and conclude that given the past uses of the site, excepting the building has been demolished, which had a lawful use for B1, B2 and B8, that the current proposed use of the site would be acceptable in this particular instance. With regards to visual amenity, given the mature landscaping to the eastern, southern and western boundaries, the reduced scale and height of the building, with the additional conditions that I've suggested, together with condition 3 that's already on your papers, to limit the footprint of the building, and with the ability to add further conditions control matters such as lighting, improved biodiversity and landscaping, then the impact on the countryside can be mitigated to an acceptable level. No objection is raised on flooding matters from the Environment Agency, and similarly the Council's Environmental Health Officer has not raised an objection relating to noise matters, but has suggested conditions to cover such matters. Sufficient distance is therefore maintained to neighbouring properties to ensure amenity is protected, and the officer's report has also suggested conditions to require the provision of an acoustic fence along the southern boundary, which is condition 15, and that's set out in your landscaping proposals. No objection is raised by the KCC Ecology, and a condition is recommended to secure biodiversity enhancements, and similarly sustainability measures are included in the building and on the site by virtue of the BREEAM rating of very good, so that's condition 13. So that's the fabric first approach, and also electric charging points in terms of condition 17. So all other matters are considered acceptable, and the application is recommended for permission. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. We have three speakers this evening. We have Mrs. Ayling, Councillor Brown from Yalding Parish Council, and Councillor Russell, who's here in person. So can I call upon Mrs. Ayling first, who's an objector, and I think you should be with us remotely. Hello?
Yes.
Right. You have 3 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to speak as an objector to the above application. This outline planning application focuses on access to the site. Appearance, landscaping, layout and scale are all reserved for future consideration. In addition, an appeal against the decision on a previous application has also been lodged with the Secretary of State. Access is indeed fundamental to the application, a key issue for residents, as can be seen in the 3 objections already submitted. The concern is that the proposed light industrial storage business units with associated facilities will generate a serious escalation of traffic, and in particular of HGVs seeking to access a site which in a tiny hamlet is totally unsuitable for such a development. The site, which is on the outer borders of Maidstone, is situated in a quiet residential area on a sharp right-angle bend in a narrow country lane. Access is via a single farm track, not shared access. It's not owned by the Paxas, but over which they have a right-of-way established in 1969 for very intermittent use of the track by small farm vehicles with trailers. This is a location that has already seen a number of accidents, the most recent being a head-on collision between a large lorry and a private car, and also the incident referred to in the objection raised by BRV Visma, where a car was driven off the road on this corner. The protective railings on the edge of the lane have also just recently been renewed, following repeated damage by out-of-control vehicles. This is only part of the problem because there is inadequate turning space on the track from the road for larger vehicles trying to access the packhouse site, an issue raised in the objection from Yalding Parish Council. In addition, the track provides access to a public footpath and to riding stables. The manoeuvring of vehicles here would put walkers and riders at risk. In the report provided by the case officer for the agenda, frequent mention is made of the need to respect the amenities of neighbouring properties. Residents, of course, appreciate the need for the packhouse site to be redeveloped 5 years on from the disastrous fire which destroyed it. However, the proposed plan fails to respect their most urgent and immediate concerns, namely the impact that the increase in traffic, especially of heavy lorries, will have on all their lives. And for that reason, I ask that this particular application be rejected. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Ayling, and well within your 3 minutes. Well done.
Thank you.
We now have Councillor Brown from Yalding Parish Council, who is with us remotely. Are you there?
Yes, Chairman, I am. Thank you.
Thank you. We can hear you, so you have 3 minutes from now.
Thank you. We're 4 years on from when the previous application came in for commercial use on this site. And at that time, at the 11th hour, Yalding Parish Council managed to get from the planning officer to get from the applicant a route at which a heavy goods vehicle could access this site. And it was obvious that it could not be done without them going across land that they had no right of access across. This meant that the landowner, if they shut the gate, the lorry couldn't get there anyway, and it would not be able to turn round. It would result in it having to reverse off onto that right-hand bend. And we do not believe that enough investigative work has been done. The lorries are getting bigger. The lorries are bigger now than they were 4 years ago. And we do not believe that an HGV can manoeuvre into that site and back out again safely, bearing in mind the other uses of that access. And from the first photograph, the aerial photograph that you saw, you can see the sharp right-hand bend. It's a narrow bend. When you're coming from the bottom of the photograph up, you turn left, that takes you into the site. You turn right. That turn right is really, really narrow. There's a ditch, there's railings that are forever being knocked over. And if you're turning left into that site and then you've got to turn immediately left again, we do not believe that sufficient information is available at this moment to members for them to be able to decide if that is a safe and a safe access and an access that the HGVs can actually fulfil without going onto other land. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've lost myself. Thank you, Councillor Brown. We now move on to Councillor Russell, who is here in person. And I'm sure you know what to do. 3 minutes from when you press the button. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, members. As luck would have it, I remember this lane distinctly as during my election leafleting, I passed a car upside down in the ditch outside of the property when I was leafleting Queen Street in the middle of a morning on a weekend. I'd really like to focus on obviously the access aspects of this application. The site is in a rural location along narrow lanes of a series of sharp bends in them. This area has seen a background increase in traffic numbers using the lane during the period since the site was last operational, and I can see no evidence within this application that this has been taken into account. If the site were to be utilised by HGV traffic, the traffic would need to turn off of Queen Street into the site and enter the private shared access, where it would need to immediately begin to turn into the site to utilise the access point that's depicted in your location plan drawings. Or from the other way, the HGV would need to navigate the turning across the other side of the road on a blind bend into the site. Either approach would potentially lead to the trailer of the HGV being left in the road on a blind bend whilst access is attempted. Whilst I note with dismay that KCC Highways have raised no objections to the proposal, I feel that some reality needs to enter into this application determination, and the committee needs to think carefully about the safe access and egress of this site for the kind of use proposed. I ask that the committee be minded to reject the application, or if they do not feel able to do this on highway grounds, to defer the application to a later planning committee, whilst asking the applicant for further access and egress information, namely visibility displays of the entrance exit, and further drawings to show that the turn into the site can actually be achieved by an HGV, bearing in mind there's also a current footpath access right at the entrance to this location with no pavement nearby. To grant this application without this further information would be granting permission for a proposal that is severely lacking in detail for how the site will actually function as an intended B1, B2, B8 site in 2021 and into the future, let alone considering whether a site of this type should be permitted in this open countryside location. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Russell. Right, we don't have a local member. Right, Councillor English and Councillor English, then Councillor Mackay.
Well, everything that's been said by the parish council and the objector may well be true, but unfortunately it gets us precisely nowhere. We've been down this road before, literally down this road before. Kent County Council Highways, as usual, have raised no objection. There is no indication whatsoever that a deferral, a request for new information or anything else will elicit a different response, because they haven't on any previous occasion in this area. It's not to say everything in connection with this application is brilliant. I really don't like blank cheques, and I think if we just approve lots of indicative drawings on the basis of that's what it's going to look like, well, they have no status, they're indicative. We could end up, like many outline applications in the past, effectively limiting ourselves to, approving a blank slate and not being able to do anything about it, because apart from the square footage condition, we haven't set out any parameters. So I'll return to that. But in terms of the highways issues, there is absolutely nothing that a deferral will achieve, and I'm not minded to waste time on such an issue, because we know damn well that it will achieve absolutely nothing. On the parameters issue, I do think that if we are thinking as an authority that this area of hard standing might be problematical, that we should at this point say, indicative statement or not, that we really don't want it. Mr. Bailey, what do you think about that? I mean, given it was raised as a problematic issue, in an outline application, we can set parameters to actually say that we don't think this is a particularly good idea if it has the impact that has been suggested.
Would you like Mr. Bailey to comment on that?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I do think that is addressed in the report that the officer sets out in terms of the landscaping detail, which would cover hard and soft landscaping. It is actually a reserved matter. The officer has, in this instance, though, put condition 15 on to deal with that matter. But I do think it's good practice on an illustrative scheme that comes forward for members either to clarify whether they find the indicative or illustrative plan acceptable or not. And I think that would then be on the decision notice and informs the reserved matters application. So you could put clearly down on this form that whilst the parameters on condition 3 sets the restrictive or floor area, the council is concerned or would not wish to see the reserved matters application or landscaping detail come forward with such an extensive area of hard standing, and therefore, by virtue of condition 15, that will need to be mitigated to soften the impact of that area. That would be perfectly reasonable and legitimate in my view, and gives a very clear signal to the agent developer of what they would expect to come forward in any future application.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Councillor Springett.
Thank you. I appreciate this is an access only, but condition 25 relates to the premises should not be open other than between the hours of 7 till 18 Monday to Friday and 8 till 18 on a Saturday. And I just think in the interest of residential amenity, 1800 on a Saturday is pretty antisocial, actually. The subsequent condition refers to HGV access, which is only until 1300 hours on a Saturday. And I would like to suggest that we amend that to 1300 hours on a Saturday, because otherwise the poor residents that live nearby are only going to get one day off from all the potential traffic and noise that this could generate. So I just wish to raise that point. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Springett. Councillor Mackay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought you forgot me for a moment. I've got to say, it's really nice to come here and find that someone doesn't want to build 10 or 20 houses on a site that was previously semi-industrial. So actually think a site that previously was a pack house, being a light industrial use, is very appropriate. Now, and as Councillor, who knows way more about these things than I do, it's not for us to determine the highways matters. I've wasted enough of my time, and so have you, Councillor Springett, on that. This is just merely an outline plan permission. Why are we wasting our time? You know, if we refuse it, they just come back and decide, well, can we build 20 houses then? Would you prefer that in Mard? I think what we want is a balanced economy and a balanced building programme. So I propose we just accept.
Is that with the amendment Councillor Springett made to the hours? Or?
I would, with reluctance, accept the amendment, but, you know, we can't have... With reluctance, I would accept the amendment.
Well, the amendments so far made are in relation into condition 3, which is proposed by Mr Bailey, and condition 25, which is proposed by Councillor Springett. So are you happy to propose we approve the application subject to those two changes to conditions 3 and 25?
I would be.
And do you have a seconder? Oh. I don't know who was first there. It was either... I'll go for Councillor English, seconded by Councillor English. There's also the informative as well. Okay. So on that basis, does anyone else have anything to say or want to comment? Okay, well, we're going to please have votes.
Sorry, Chair, just a quick clarification.
Oh, sorry,
on condition 3, the floor area is up to 345 square metres in total, or is that... So in other words, you could get one unit on there, 345 square metres. At the moment, what they've got is they're proposing 3 individual units to sit for illustrative purposes. So you could have 3 units divided up into 345 square metres, or one 345 square metre unit. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, correct. You are correct to raise that matter. I was looking at just restricting the size of the unit, but quite rightly members could see that the proposal should come forward as 3 individual units with a total floor area of 345 square metres. So that's the parameter. And that would follow the illustrative detail. Well, it determines the end user, doesn't it? Because the larger the unit will determine the different types of end user. The smaller the unit is more light industrial. So.
Thank you, Mr Bailey. Councillor Mackay, you want to come back?
I would say that is pointless. If one company owns 3 units, it would operate as 1 unit. It's just meaningless. I mean, I've worked for a company that bought 3 units. It ended up being 1 unit. Maybe 3 units out of... You know, these are sheds we're talking about. You just take down an internal wall, for God's sake. Yeah, does it matter? It doesn't matter at all.
I think the critical thing here is the overall floor space, isn't it? The 375 square metres, yeah. 345, sorry. Right, there we go. Right, okay. We've had a proposition, it has been seconded. Can I have votes in favour, please? And votes against? Any abstentions? 1 abstention. Thank you, Councillor Round. So that then is carried. Permission is granted. Thank you very much, members. Right, councillors, before we move on to item... Where are we? I've lost my papers. Yeah. I just wanted to ask if any council wishes to speak against the recommendation. Where are we?
Item 19.
Item 19, sorry.
Page 104.
Page 104 on the agenda. Lapsing a TPO. Does anybody wish to speak? Does anybody wish to speak against the motion? Because if there isn't, I propose from the chair that we approve the recommendation as on the papers. But I would like to ask the speakers who are here if they would like to waive their right to speak. But you do have a right to speak. Well, that is the indication from all the members. I will propose from the chair that we accept the recommendation of the officers. And if I can have a seconder. Councillor Cox, thank you very, very much. And votes in favour, please, councillors. Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Councillor Cooling. Oh, sorry, votes against. Oh. Okay, well, thank you very much for turning up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gallivan, for attending on the call. Sorry your services weren't required, but thank you very much.
Sorry.
Quite a good time, I think, 9 o'clock.
Okay, members, it's been 2 hours. I propose we have a break for 10 minutes. Oh, crack on. All right. Okay, if you're happy. Right. Right, item 15, members. Sorry, they didn't want a break. I thought they would. There we are. Good for them. Right, item number 15, which is Bletchenden Farm, Bletchenden Road. I will ask Rachel Elliott to present her report. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. The application relates to the conversion of a heritage fashion barn to residential, including the demolition of modern pole barns and the erection of single-storey extension to the side and the erection of detached triple garage. The works are now part retrospective and will set out later in the presentation the extent of the retrospective nature. The site is situated outside the settlement boundary and as such is defined as countryside under the current local plan. The site is also within the low-wheeled landscape of local value, and landscape character assessment study seeks to conserve and reinforce the undeveloped rural landscape and remote qualities of isolated farmsteads and hamlets. The site is accessed from a private drive off Bletchenden Road leading here to the site. You're not here? Sorry. Sorry, is that better? Yeah, that's sorry, apologies. And the building is considered curtilage listed by its association with Bletchenden Manor Farm to the east, with another listed building to the north east, the granary. Sorry. Yeah. There are a number of public rights of way surrounding the site. To the north here, indicated by the red pink dotted line, to the south and to the east. The greatest views of the site are afforded from the public right of way to the north, which you can see from the aerial photograph. Tree belt screens the site from the south, again from the east, and the existing built development also provides additional screening from the east of the site. The site is within flood zones 2 and 3, and due to the proposed use, it's considered more vulnerable, but as addressed in the committee report at paragraphs 6.38 to 6.46, the applicants have raised the private bund surrounding the wider Bletchington estate to mitigate the risk of flooding, and the proposal is considered acceptable in relation to satisfying both the sequential and exception tests set out in the MPPF. Residential conversions are taking place for some surrounding agriculture buildings, notably this site to the west, and a prior notification has been approved previously for the building to the north. Planning permission is previously granted for the conversion of the application building to residential in 2005 and then more recently in 2018 under a 2016 consent. Both consents have now times expired and were not implemented. Both proposed a single-storey extension to the side of the existing barn. This is shown at paragraph 6.13 of the committee report. The previously approved extensions being approximately 12 metres in width compared to the 25 metres now proposed. As such, in principle, no objection is raised to the residential conversion of the original barn, as this would seek to preserve a heritage asset and residential use is considered the most appropriate reuse of the building. Listed building consent has been granted for proposed works, and as such, no objection is raised to the proposal on heritage grounds, and the Conservation is happy with the proposal. The scheme, in fact, follows pre-application discussions where the applicant was advised to provide an elongated extension to the building, rather than provide additional accommodation in the roof space of the original barn, or join the barn to an existing outbuilding. As such, members' attention is drawn to the fact that the proposed recommendation is contrary to the pre-application advice, where the application is recommended refusal. This follows review by senior officers who, on this odd occasion, disagreed with the original case officer's advice and considered that the proposal would not accord with policy DM1 of the local plan, which, although allowing conversions of agricultural buildings to be acceptable, it is required that the conversion takes place without major works or reconstruction. To facilitate the conversion, a large extension and detached garage is proposed, resulting in significant built form than those of the earlier consents, resulting in a non-modest extension which is considered harmful to the countryside, introducing existing significant built form, elongating the building and appearing akin to 4 separate buildings on the site, whereby no justification is provided to outweigh the harm. You can see from the existing plans, the pole barns described in the description were to the west of the original building, which is highlighted, which is this part of the building here. So this is the original listed part, and this was where the pole barns were. When looking at the pole barns in elevation, these were flat roof, low key structures, which from the photos you can see were partly open, wooden clad, pertaining to the former agricultural use of the barn. These structures were, however, demolished during the course of considering this application. For planning purposes, these are therefore no longer considered in existence, and limited weight can be attached to those structures and determine whether the proposed extensions would be acceptable. The proposal to convert the existing barn and erect an extension is set out in summary in section 2 of the committee report. Here in the floor plans, you can see that this is the existing barn here. You'll have residential accommodation on the ground floor and parts of the first floor converted here with bedrooms. And then you've got the 2 parts of the extension linked by a glazed link in the middle, one part here and one part here. And then you can just see the footprint of the proposed triple garage, which will be at right angles to the extension. In elevation form, this is the existing building, which will be converted and upgraded. And you've got these parts as the extension. In principle, the previous extension was approximately the size of this first part of the extension shown here. The triple garage, as I said, it's a garage with internal staircase and accommodation above. This is the existing barn, which has been stripped back. It's got a corrugated roof, timber framed internally. In terms of the works that have already been carried out on the site, members will see from the photographs, the works have significantly commenced on the construction of the scheme before you're here. So you can see the proposed extensions. The glazed link would be in between the 2 buildings here. the other part of the extension, and this is the triple bay garage. This is a view from the access road immediately to the north of the site. You can see the two extensions here. You can just see the corrugated roof of the original barn with granary in the forefront. In terms of the most views from the public realm, these are the views from the public right-of-way, which is to the north of the site. Again, you can see the original barn, the extensions, and the double garage or triple garage. Moving further along the public right-of-way, you've got another agricultural barn which has extant consent for conversion to residential. And here you can see the flank end of the proposed garage, the second part of the extension, and then obviously the wider building is here. In the previously consented scheme, there would be no built form or no built development that would be visible from this part of the public right-of-way, as this is the extended part of the proposal. All other matters, material planning considerations are considered in the report, and principally refusal is on the grounds that the extent of the works proposed to convert the barn go beyond that reasonably necessary to undertake the conversion, and no further justification provided to why such a large extension is required, and due to the extent of additional built form proposed would be harmful to the character and appearance of the countryside, contrary to policy, and the application is therefore recommended for refusal for the reasons set out in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Elliott. Very, very comprehensive. We have one public speaker who is the applicant, Mr Osborne, who is here in person. Could I please ask you to come to the desk? I'm sure you know how it works. Press the button and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr Chairman and members of the committee. My name is Guy Osborne. I'm from Country House Homes, and I'm acting as the agent to the applicants, who are Mr and Mrs Pearce, who are seeking to make this property their new home. I'm certain that James will inform you that his officer's recommendation is sound in planning policy terms. However, planning isn't always about policy. It's also about people. It's about their homes, about their livelihoods, and about agreements that people make between each other. In this particular matter, I spent considerable time with two highly respected officers of the council in pre-application discussions. At this meeting, the officers took the pen from my hand and advocated that we utilise the whole of the existing pole barns as accommodation. They said that they would support the scheme if we came forward with such a proposal. We spent some time tweaking the plans, refining them, going backwards and forwards, until we had a set of plans that Paul Robertshaw and Louise Welsford were entirely happy with. Those two officers were pleased with the plans, so much so that they approved the listed building consent, which they would not have done if they hadn't have considered the scheme to be suitable. Unfortunately, these officers are no longer with the council, and a new officer has been appointed to the case who has a differing view because these are subjective matters. I respect those views. However, I really cannot countenance how that we can be agreement with officers, that we can have a scheme that we've put forward and agreed at pre-app that can then be turned round and recommended for refusal, particularly after a listed building consent has been granted. And clearly officers were happy with that scheme. I'm then left with, what's the point of going into pre-app with officers? What are we going to do if we get a determination that follows the recommendation? Every time I have a pre-app, I'm going to have to approach James and I'm going to have to ask him, is this pre-app advice sound from your officers? Am I really going to be able to move forward with a scheme for this? Additionally, when it comes to dealing with my clients and future clients, am I really going to encourage them to spend money on high quality, good proposals such as this one, thinking that the pre-app advice that I've been given could be completely turned over because of subjective matter? In my view, I don't think this does have a detrimental harm to the landscape or on the character of the setting of the site. I think it's a better scheme than that was previously there. It's got a greater character, it's got good quality. The scheme includes backlofts, which are some 200% greater than the backlofts in the original approval.
I need to stop you there, I'm afraid, Mr. Osborne.
Thank you.
I'm very sorry.
No problem. Too many spaces. Thanks very much.
It's the rules we have to abide by. Thank you very much. Right, we have no other public speakers. Can I come to the local member, Councillor Round?
Thank you, Chair. I'm not going to state any policy decisions, and I'm not going to make any commitments one way or another in this respect. I'd like to actually go back to Mr. Osborne's point. I've been sitting on this committee for something like, well, umpteen years, let's say this. And when you look at this history, it's self-explanatory. I've sat here and I've listened to every one of these applications that have been brought up. And I'm really, to be perfectly honest, getting a bit bored with it. There have been so many applications made, and generally in principle, it's been supported to build something. Let's say whatever it is, but to build something and come up with a conversion that looks acceptable. And here we are again. That's the last thing I wanted to do, is come and sub on this committee and hear this one for the umpteenth time. I think we're really in a rock and a hard place, because whatever happens, nobody seems to want to agree and nobody wants to take forward. I would have thought by now we'd have some agreed scheme. That's what really upsets me, and I'm just going to leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor Rounds. Now I have Councillor English and then Harwood and then... Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Councillor Sminsky. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to support Martin's comments there. However, I have visited the site myself, and it definitely could do with a development. It is an eyesore at the moment. I would like to see, I don't know if we can, any specific agreements to the pre-app advice. Do we have that at all? In writing anywhere? Would you like to go back to it?
If I can just, come back on that point. I mean, the officers, the reasons why the report is in front of members is for that specific reason. It is accepted that pre-application advice did support this application. However, I would just add that pre-application advice, and I've got some sympathy with the applicant and their agent, however, I do have to say that pre-application advice is not binding on this council. Members, need to take that decision. This report has been brought to this committee purely on the basis of a change in officer advice. And we thought it only transparent that the applicant be given that opportunity to have their say in planning the committee, because it could have been dealt with under delegated powers. Mr. Jarman had delegated powers on this. We didn't think it appropriate in this instance to do that. So it has been brought back, but I think members need to remember that whilst I am sympathetic to the applicant and the concerns, the case officer has set out that there was no planning permission for the building as constructed. The council is supportive, as the officer has said, about reuse of that barn, and it had permission for a previous scheme, which I can say that the council would be supportive of. The previous conditions weren't complied with and they lapsed, therefore that's why those permissions lapsed. I don't want to influence, members just need to make a decision tonight as to whether this complies with the development plan or not, notwithstanding what has been constructed. But please just remember on the basis that whilst I don't like, and it should be an exceptional, truly exceptional case, that if an officer gives a pre-application advice, that we go against that advice. But it does occur occasionally, and you're not bound by that pre-application advice. And if you want some guidance on that, maybe the legal officer should give that now in terms of the weight that you attach to pre-application advice. And maybe, Chairman, if it's okay with you.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Bailey. Can I ask the legal officer for his advice, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All I'm going to do is just read what the MPPG says on it. Pre-application advice provided by the local planning authority cannot preempt the democratic decision-making process or a particular outcome in the event that a formal planning application is made. The advice could, however, be a material consideration to be taken into account and given weight in the planning application process.
Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. That's very kind of you. Councillor Szymanski.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying about the pre-app advice. I just think it would be interesting to see what was said in it as background of this. And my second point really was that I do believe that the development as it is there is excessive in relation to what's there already and the footprint. It's a difficult call because the place does need something. It definitely needs something. So maybe a change has got to be made, but it definitely needs development of some sort. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Szymanski. Councillor English.
We can't have pre-application advice discussed openly in a planning committee meeting. That would cause all sorts of legal and ethical problems and confuse processes. What is germane here, though, is that a listed building consent has been granted. Having that, I think the ground of refusal is quite difficult to sustain as it's currently written, because it actually refers to the impact on the curtilage listed barn. And we've actually got a listed building consent that should have taken that issue into account in making its decision. I would think we'd be opening ourselves to all sorts of accusations of inconsistency if we said if we used in a refusal of a planning application an impact on a neighbouring listed building which we hadn't taken into account in the listed building consent. I think that's quite a difficult one to argue, to be honest. Looking at the report, it's quite notable that the current conservation officer doesn't have a problem with the application, and in the report it actually refers to the fact that the form of the built development effectively mirrors the outbuildings that were there before. Regardless of whether they're now felt to be defunct, they were there, so the building that would be put in place would effectively be replicating a form of development that had previously existed. And it goes on also in the report to say the works would preserve the special interest, character, appearance of the significant building, and the proposals are considered to comply with policies DM4 and SP18 of the local plan and the aims of the MPPF. I mean, there's quite a lot of strong, if you actually read the report, I'm actually struggling to see how the recommendation was come up with, given how many positive comments are made in the report about the application. So I'm really quite struggling with this one. I actually can't see anything wrong with it.
I now have Councillor Springett and then, Councillor Harwood and then Councillor Springett.
Yeah, I'll try and be as brief as I can, and I think a lot of the procedural issues around the weight of the listed building consent and the pre-application advice have been taken into account, and the conservation officer. I'm coming at this more from the harm. This is a site I know very well. I knew it when it was a working farm, certainly back in the 1970s. I used to spend a lot of time dabbling in the ponds there, as you do, which is pretty much what I do now. I haven't moved on very much. it was kind of an L-shaped construction going along the site, and it was very linear, and it was really quite Darling Buds of May, I seem to recall it at the time then, and it always seemed to be sunny, and it was much more open, you know. But I think that the really critical point is that the enclosure of that site by the woodland, and therefore I think you can get away with the scale because of the enclosure and the scale of the woodland that's around the site. And everything on that site is on quite a large scale. So I actually think that the footprint that's proposed works. I think it works in terms of the architectural approach which is being promoted. So I do not see that there is a ground for refusal on harm to the countryside because of its sense of enclosure. However, what if we were to grant permission, there would be a very long list of conditions that would have to be added to this. And I mean, that's, you know, not just the very complex ones around the materials for such a kind of important building and taking into account everything that the conservation officer has said, but there are critical points there around lighting, for example. If you were to introduce significant lighting in this kind of enclave in the woods, it would have quite serious deleterious impact. So we'd need to tackle that. Clearly, in terms of landscaping, that would need to be tackled. The area has been completely cleared around the ponds now. Historically, there was a really lovely old black poplar that used to stand next to those ponds, and it would be very nice to, as I say, that all led to that kind of Darling Buds of May ambience. So I think it requires quite a lot of work to get us where we want to go. So I'd therefore like to perhaps, I know procedurally the best way to do this is it a deferral to allow time for officers to work up the grounds which would have been imposed on, in this site on such a sensitive location. We've certainly done that in the past, and then we can perhaps discuss with the list of grounds that will be required, balanced against the officer harm angle to see how it balances out.
Ask Mr. Bailey to come back to you on that one, Councillor Holwood.
I think in principle that's how it could work. I was going to suggest I think there is a good stance if members voting on a principle that they're minded to approve the application based on what they've seen tonight, which is an effectively overturn of officer recommendation, and they give reasons for that. However, what they'd wish to see is a full list of conditions coming back to this committee, maybe at the next cycle, and a formal decision on the application would be taken at that stage. And I defer to the legal officer just to check the reasoning behind that, but I think it fair that the agent is in the room tonight, that members give a very strong steer as to that they're minded to approve subject to the appropriate conditions, but the final decision is taken on the next cycle when the conditions in front of them, and that's a very clear stance, gives the applicant, who's probably a bit anxious at the moment, a clear steer where members are going, and you have the full conditions in front of you. I just defer to the officer at the moment. Is a deferment for a cycle or that basis reasonable to get something back to members? So there we are, members. I think that's, if you give a clear decision tonight which way you're heading, but actually you're not voting on that, you're giving a very clear steer. Is that okay, legal officer, on that view? And then that gives sort of some comfort to those further conditions coming forward.
Just like to ask the legal officer, do we actually need to vote on a deferment? Okay, I have other councillors wishing to speak. I have Councillor Springett, Perry, Cox and Mackay. Councillor Springett.
Thank you. I'm coming up from this from a different angle, actually. I do think it's too much development on the site. When you add the garage in as well, I think it goes from side to side of this, right from boundary to boundary, and then you've got the garage. So actually, I think it is too much. I would support, I don't think anyone's against the barn being renovated at all. No one's against that. And I think if it was a barn and one building added on, I'd be much, much happier. But with both bits, I just think it's too wide. Pre-app discussions, I believe if you were to read the report on the appeal number 2, residential development of 2 number detached dwellings in land to the east of Chapel Lane, the pre-app advice on that was positive for the 2 dwellings, yet the appeal inspector has dismissed the appeal and said that pre-app advice is not, you know, a determining factor. So I'm pretty certain that on that particular one, the inspector noted that pre-app advice is just advice and it gives no certainty at all or guarantee. I'm really disappointed that they started work on the barn without checking for bats. I think that's quite disgraceful. I'm very sorry. I want that on record. And I'm really disappointed that the building is going ahead gung-ho before the permission. It shows total disrespect to the planning system. We've got previous conditions on previous things not adhered to. So if this is recommended for approval, I would like us to quite closely monitor the conditions that we apply to make sure they are adhered to in this case, because disrespect is being shown to the planning system in numerous ways. So I'm not happy with this application as it stands. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Springett. Councillor Perry, and then Cox, and then Mackay.
Oh, strangely, I take a slightly different view from my esteemed colleague. When I read this report, and when I read it, I think I'm similar conclusions to Councillor English on this. As I was reading it, I was thinking, oh yeah, okay, you know, this seems quite reasonable. Then I got to the recommendation, and it went completely against what I was actually thinking. So I was slightly surprised. So clearly there's a lot of subjectivity in this. But I'm just coming back to these pole barns. This extension is replacing... I'll wait till... We seem to have 2 meetings here. Sorry, Chairman. The pole barns, the extension seems to be replacing the pole barns. The pole barns are a bit of a state, and it seems to me actually... Whatever one thinks about the process, and I agree there have been issues with the pre-app, there have been all sorts of issues, but I don't want to go into that. I'm just looking at this particular proposal. And I actually think, when I look at it, I think it's a proposal I could support, actually, because I think it is quite reasonable. So I'm very much in favour of what both Councillor Harwood and Councillor English... I find myself agreeing with you on those things tonight, but I think if we could defer it or agree in principle, which is what I think I would quite like to do, and then obviously bring it back with the more detailed conditions, then that's fine by me. I think that's a very sound approach, and I would certainly support that. But it was finely balanced, I would say that, but I think reading the report and everything, personally, I came down on the side of being in favour of the development. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Perry, and I do apologise for being distracted for a few seconds while he was speaking. I do apologise about that. Right, I now have Councillor Cox and then Councillor Mackay. Councillor Cox, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Just really to sort of say that very similar to all those that have spoken previously, other than Councillor Springett. But when you look at a group of buildings like this, and it's now going from being a farm to a residential accommodation, buildings are going to have to take on different uses. And they're taking a similar footprint, but whereas it could have housed tractors, it will now house cars. And you might have had pickers, workers that might have slept in the top of a barn. So I think the uses of these buildings will end up very similar, but very different. So I do think that this needs to have the applications that Councillor Harwood is asking for, and we need the consideration and to have something firm in front of us. But I think there is the overall consensus that if it is brought back, with the light of approval ahead of us, then there would be the things that we're going to need to see that we would normally expect. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. Councillor Mackay?
I think Councillor Round either wants to go to the lavatory or has something important to say, so I will defer to Councillor Round.
In other words, you had nothing to say.
I do, but he was waving furiously. Sorry, I will keep very brief. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and clearly this application is subjective. Now, one of my favourite programmes on TV is Grand Design. Now, and I think we have someone here that's possibly trying to be inspired by such a programme. It may be too big. Who needs a garage for three cars? But you know what? We need ambition in this world. So good luck to you. I think we should proceed with vigour and apply the most appropriate conditions to it. Yes. But let's turn a muddy field or derelict field plot into a beautiful home.
Thank you, Councillor Mackay. I'm glad I persisted with getting you to speak. Thank you. Very, very. Councillor Round.
Sorry, I mean, I want to refer back to Councillor Springett and just say, I can promise you, Val, I've sat through all of these planning applications and there's an awful lot of history here. And I don't go back as far as Councillor Harwood's tadpoling in the ponds down there. But I've known this site for years, ever since I was a kid. I've known it in and out, and through some pretty funny times, quite frankly. And what I can tell you, and hopefully it'll make you feel better, when these original applications were made, a whole wildlife study was made. And that whole wildlife study included an owl study, a bat study, a reptile study, and one of the previous iterations, which I cannot remember whether it was 4 years ago, 5 years ago, or whatever, but I can remember Councillor Cox certainly sitting on the other side of the table at a planning committee at one of them, so Councillor English was chairing it at the time. But what I do remember is that it was a very detailed wildlife study. And I actually went down there and I actually watched the actual study taking place, and Kent Wildlife Trust did it. And it was, but to be perfectly honest, one of the best bits of work I'd ever seen. Kent Wildlife Trust know what they're doing. That was probably 4 or 5 years ago. And since then, those animals have not come back because they've been rehomed in another part about a mile away. And bats and owls and foxes even, and they're all very, very happy where they are because there's a nice bit of woodland just the other side. And they're all living very happily over there. I've seen them, and in fact they have bred, and they're actually more substantial. There's many more of them now. And it also includes some nightingales and some buzzards as well in that. So it's actually enhanced a local woodland the other side. It has actually been very effective. So as far as the wildlife side is concerned, I think much has been done. Although, I mean, animals are notoriously moving ones, but I've certainly seen some very good examples of wildlife not about a mile away from here, which has been worked very well. And as I say, I think all thanks should go to Kent Wildlife Trust, who did that original survey. I think it was about 5 years ago, but I can't remember. But just wanted to mention that.
Thank you, Councillor Round. We do value local knowledge. Councillor Mumford, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, it's very quick. Just for members, when you start looking at pole sheds or buildings that contain hot poles, they are big. Then you've got ladder sheds, which 50 rung ladders, you know, they're extremely long. I live in 24 converted hopper huts, so again, very long, low and flat. The only thing that I'd like to say to the planners, you've asked us to make a decision, either approve or refuse. And the problem is we can't make one to approve because we don't know what the conditions would be that would be applied. So it's a no decision. It's either defer it waiting for conditions or refuse it. That's what we're being faced with. We are not being faced with either refuse or approve. It's either defer or refuse. Just a point.
Thank you, Councillor Mumford. As I understand it, and I'm sure Mr. Bailey or Mr. Fitzpatrick will correct me if I'm wrong, but what I think you're minded to do is to issue what I would call a minded to approve letter to the applicant and instruct Mr. Bailey to discuss with the applicant that the members are minded to approve, subject to the drawing up of a schedule of appropriate conditions and informatives and legal agreements, whatever else might be necessary. Does that summarise your thoughts? Yes?
Can I just check, are you talking, here we're talking about minded to approve. I don't think we're talking necessarily about a letter. I think what you're saying, we're minded to approve for the following reasons. The reason why James is looking for reasons is so that can give him some steer as to the conditions which he comes back, with, because what he doesn't want to do is end up with like an approval and then come back with conditions and say, well, with those conditions I wouldn't approve it. So we're looking for a minded to approve in principle with reasons, so you can guide James and his team with regards to the conditions. But you want the matter to come back on hopefully on the next cycle with that list of conditions for discussion, yeah?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. Mr. Bailey?
Yeah, and obviously we're going to, because it's a change to officer recommendation, we'd need to include as to the reasons why members are minded to approve contrary to the officer view, so that's clearly set out. I think that's the correct approach in my view to give the applicant some confidence moving forward. And we'd obviously then come forward in the next cycle to bring those conditions that you could discuss with, and you could find out whether they're acceptable or not on that basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Thank you, Mr. Fitzpatrick. So I just need to take a vote on whether you are...
Sorry? Reasons. So reasons first for the overturn.
Yeah. Tony and I were going to give you some reasons. I defer to Councillor Harwood.
So do you want to come up?
Member overturn.
Oh, right, okay. Okay.
Yeah, the reason for the member overturn of the officer recommendation is that the committee, on balance, felt that the proposed scheme interpreted the historic form of the farm buildings on the site in a successful manner, and that the enclosure provided by the surrounding woodland enabled the larger scale of development proposed without harmful impact on the wider countryside. Further, the committee were cognizant of the views of the council's conservation officer, of which they were generally supportive. And I think that picks up all of the three strands. There's a few points, though, in relation to the conditions, because there's all the standard conditions that will come through on materials and integral niches for wildlife and so on, which will be important because of the bat issue and so on. But I think that there's further issues like kind of the lighting issue, and I suggest because of the significance of bats in this area, if we could look potentially at using red filters for external lighting, it would reduce harm, and I think that's relatively new science. So perhaps we should note that down for discussions. The renewable energy approach will need to be quite sensitive because of the historic nature of this building. So I think that's another area which will need to be bottomed out prior to coming to committee. And in terms of the landscape approach, that should take cues from a traditional low-wheeled farm settlement, because the previous setting, and should incorporate a specimen black poplar, and that's Populus nigra. Because I think that's it's a really specific motif of this part of Headcorn. I don't know if there's any other issues that other members of the committee think are beyond our normal conditions, but I would flag those. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Well, that sounded very comprehensive to me, but of course those conditions will come back to this committee, so we can comment on them at that time. Has any other councillor got anything they'd like to say, to add? Okay. In which case we just need to take a vote on proceeding the way we have been discussing. Can your votes in favour, please? Sorry, I think...
I've been promoted. I'm assuming on that basis members would also look at removal of PD rights, given the quite extensive extension that's already there on all accounts as well, just to make sure we address those points. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Right, at last. Right, votes in favour, please. Okay, thank you. And votes against? One vote against. There are no abstentions. Okay. That is then carried. Thank you very much, members. Thank you for an interesting debate. Very interesting. Thank you, Mr. Osborne, for coming along and speaking to us. You're very welcome. Oh. Item 18. Right, members. Can we carry on? Have item number 18, Newham Court Shopping Village, Bearsted Road, Weaver in Kent. Can I ask Mr. Bailey to present the report, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. I'll try to be as succinct as I can. This report comes back to you with further detail. I know when you resolved to approve the application, you resolved to approve it subject to a number of conditions, and you've now got sort of a more holistic, I should say, report which looks around at the other applications on the site as well, which are influencing this application. So this is being brought back following the committee's decision on the 21st of October. The minutes are available on page 91 of your report, and I'll draw you in particular attention to condition 1C, which sets out that the management plan shall include details of bunding around the perimeter of the entire site with landscaping in accordance with the landscape character assessment. In terms of going through the application details, obviously that was agreed on the night. On further reflection, discussion in terms with the legal officer and myself, it was considered that that condition would be very difficult to seek compliance with, and therefore we entered into discussions with the applicant to get some further detail around that, as whether that was a reasonable condition to impose on the application. This application also came forward with some additional details regarding the land ownership of the site, which is this blue line, so that is owned by Pantony on the application. So what that does is also gives clarity that... Oh, Oh, I do apologise. Sorry, I thought I was. God, I've even gone forward and I'm not even presenting.
James, can you start your presentation again?
Yeah, I'm going to. Right, I do apologise for that, members. I'd even forgotten my presentation thing. So, if I start again, if that's okay, for webcast recording purposes. So, this application is brought back to members following the committee decision on the 21st of October. Minutes are available on page 91 of your papers, and I draw your specific attention to the resolution on that night on the minutes, which was condition 1C, which said required that the management plan should include details of bunding around the perimeter of the entire site with landscaping in accordance with the landscape character guidance. On further reflection and discussion with the legal officer, we were considering whether the requirements of that condition were reasonable, and that led to a further discussion with the applicant, which has led to the report being brought back to this committee on the basis of what's set out in the report. And just to summarise some, I'll come on to that in a second, I'd just like to add that in terms of 1A, in terms of the acoustic survey, on the night there was discussions about whether the applicant, i.e. which was Pantony, Mr. Pantony, who owns this site, could actually comply with the terms of that condition. And obviously since that time we've had this Blue Lion land comes up, so that condition is reasonable, meets the tests, and that can be applied. So we won't discuss that further. That was the resolution on the night. But what we are coming back to you is on 1C, and whether that condition was reasonable to be imposed. So we went back to the applicant, who was aware of the members' resolution on the night, and what you've got in front of you on the papers is the applicant's response together with the officer's response. So just to go through with that, you would have seen this is the application site, the red line boundary. Again, I won't go into too much detail. It had a lawful development certificate for its use, for the turning of vehicles on the site, so that is established, its use is established. What members were considering was just the hard standing, the operational works. And obviously members required, as the management plan, to sort of have a bund with planting on top around the entire site. This application provides some more detail, and that detail I'll just very briefly go through. KCC effectively have approved one application, which is this new access road into the site, and this is all part of the sort of the works, the dualling works that they're proposing to create capacity at the junction along that road. And effectively, so KCC have, oh my mouse has gone to sleep, KCC have approved this road here. This road is an application that is waiting with KCC to be determined, and it is dependent on this application site here. So you've now got the sort of the wider picture. So this application here provides and is set out in your papers. It's set out on 2.01, the background information. And so if members just want to sort of have a quick opportunity, if you haven't had an opportunity to read that, I will very briefly discuss that. But there is an application which is this road, this link road, which is designed for HGVs and other vehicles to deliver to the Newnham Court shopping area as a result of the requirement of this new access road. So this is a waiting determination by KCC. It proposes a concrete apron at the top here, which is directly adjacent to the application site, which you've got here. So again, this is undetermined, but then if you put a bund around this entire site, you can see, looking at the wider site, KCC's plans wouldn't work. Now, members aren't considering this application next door, but it puts some context as to the application details and the conditions you're looking to impose. So we're not asking members to consider this application, we're just giving some background information to that. In effect, the report sets out that you couldn't have, in their view, landscaping to this southern quadrant, to this eastern quadrant, or to the western quadrant here, but what KCC are suggesting is that they could plant a native hedgerow across the top area here along the effectively northeast boundary of the site, which you can see from this plan, which would be outside the red line area, but you could impose it because it's owned by the applicant. And they are suggesting that, and the officers are again similarly supporting that view, that would provide additional mitigation to the north of the site. And they use that as justification on the basis that you've got this existing building here, you've got the area outside the existing building, which I'll show you on the aerial photographs. So in terms of mitigating the impact, the main mitigation is acquiring to the north of this area here. So the kind of consideration that members need to give tonight, and that's why the report is coming back to you, is are members still requiring a bund and planting on top around the entire site, or will members be prepared to accept the mitigation that's being put forward now, which is that landscaping to the northeast and top of the site here? But in terms of, you know, with the wider context of the site, this whole proposal is looking at it links up with the wider scheme to provide the dualling of the road to the south and the relocation of the access. And for consideration, that has been approved by KCC already, so the relocation of the access has been agreed. What hasn't been determined at this stage is this link road up here. So if there's members have got any, that's the end of the officer presentation, but if members have got any concerns or require further clarity, I think it's sort of important to get that matter addressed at this particular point in time. But as it stands, the application is recommended for approval subject to that amended wording as set out on your papers on page 95 and 96. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. We have one member of the public who is down to speak, Mr. Cook. I'm sorry you've had a long wait. Thank you for your patience. I know you've been here before, so if you come to the desk, and you have 3 minutes from when you press the middle button. Thank you.
Right. I'd like to introduce myself again, as it's been a few weeks since I was at the last meeting. I'm Simon Cook, and we own Newnham Court, and the curtilage of our house is about 10 metres away from the application site. New information has been added to this application since the last planning meeting on the 21st of October 2021. This information is not contained in the original application and has been added without any new consultations. This application has to be considered on its own merit, and as the new information relates to a different application, the new information is not relevant to this application. The new information is also incorrect, as Kent County Council already has planning permission for highways improvements, and an incorrect agreement between Kent County Council and the landowner is actually the cause of the delays in the highways improvements. There is plenty of other land available that could be used for a new goods distribution area, but instead Kent County Council and the landowner want to make a new goods distribution area about 10 metres away from our property. As all applications have to be considered on their own merit, the planning permission that Kent County Council has already been granted for the highways improvements must be a complete and viable permission. The application site is a standalone area of concrete, and there has been no planning permission granted for the access to the site. There are no valid reasons why bunding around the perimeter of the entire site should not be a condition of this planning permission. The bunding around the perimeter of the entire site should be within the red line, as if that was the original application type. site. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. We have a local member, Councillor Brindle. Would you like to have some comments?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members. I've reread this again and again. I realise that we have to just look at what's before us this evening, sorry, it's been a long day. My only concern is that on reading the report under para 610 and 611, which relate to the noise issues, I can see that it's proposed that the new hard standing will enable HGVs to manoeuvre more easily, and therefore the possible reduction in the noise from their reversing alarms is put forward as mitigation. The only thing I would add to that is that it isn't only HGVs that make the noise. The forklift trucks, when they're unloading, their alarms go much more than the reversing of the HGVs. And I would like, please, for the acoustic survey that's undertaken includes not only HGVs, but the noise from reversing alarms on forklift trucks. If I look at the proposal to not include the bund, but perhaps look at planting the hedge, if we don't go with the bund around the area that's now above the proposed new concrete apron, can we please have a condition that asks for the planting to be evergreen trees so as to help mitigate any noise there might be? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Brindle. I think I had Councillor Cox, and I think Councillor Mackay may have had his hand up at one time. No? No? Yeah. You did? Okay, so it'll be Cox, Mackay and Holman. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think to show us this map or this plan now with the additional information actually sort of shows that we couldn't have a bund all the way round it, and when we actually agreed that, as I was going home I was thinking that's strange, how are they going to get in and out? There's a building to the south of it anyway, so why are we putting a bund right by the building that's there, I believe? I think the bund will deflect the noise. It may deflect the noise, but I think we need to have some more protection as mitigation of this sound. Not only the investigation of what sound there's going to be and how to mitigate it, but it needs to be solely to deflect the noise away from the objector, from Mr. Cook. Because everywhere else, south and east of it, is all part of the Not Cuts area. And therefore, I think we should be looking, obviously now this is coming away from that area with this new road that we now are told about, that KCC have approved. So we need to solely be looking at the northern perimeter and the northwestern perimeter. And I think if that means that there should be an actual fence like you might see around the motorway that would deflect and absorb this sound, I think that's what we should be asking to have done. But I do think that Councillor Brindle is bang on. It's not just going to be the noise of the HGVs, because there's probably 40 transactions between a forklift truck taking the stuff off, and that is worse than just once the truck's got to leave, it may have to reverse. The forklifts are the problem. I think it needs to be the north and the northwestern section, and I think it needs to be something substantial to try and protect the sanity of Mr. Cook. Thank you.
I'll ask Mr. Bailey to come back on that. What you're asking for is a noise attenuation fence or something like they do on motorway barriers. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Bailey?
The resolution that was agreed by members last time was that the management plan should include, which is set out on page 95.b, IB, that the acoustic survey should be submitted to demonstrate whether an acoustic barrier is required to protect the amenity of occupants of Newnham Court. So that's already in play. The issue on A is measures to reduce, this is what the management plan will need to substantiate, measures to reduce the potential of noise disturbance to neighbours, including the time of deliveries, use of audible reversing alarms, which is what the concern's been raised by Councillor Brindle. So I think that resolution is already intact, and we've now got the confidence that that's within the ownership of the applicant, and therefore it's within Blue Line land, and therefore it's reasonable to impose that condition on this permission were it to be granted. So I think that is covered, and the results of that, I don't think it would be reasonable to impose you put an acoustic survey up at this stage, because we haven't got the evidence, and this is what this will seek to produce.
I understand what you're saying, but what I mean is it shouldn't be all around it. I'm proposing that it's for the northwest and the northern side, from where the compass is looking here. It's the top.
Yeah.
So yeah, I agree with what you said, and everything is in place. But to go all the way round the site, obviously is even more futile if we've now got this road coming in, because they would be going through the Blue Line site that we're talking about. So I'm saying that whatever, be it a bund or whatever comes out from the acoustic reference, it needs to be the northwest and the northern side to protect Mr. Cook, not anything to the south. It's not needed.
Mr. Bailey?
Yeah, I think what the acoustic survey was demonstrate is where that acoustic fence would need to be positioned, because I think we'd need to leave it to the experts to decide where it would need to be most effective. If we start imposing requirements now, we may limit where it needs to go as set out by the study. So I see what you're saying, but I think in terms of, I think the condition as framed now allows the report to come through. And if it is required, it will have to set out where it is required, what height, what dimension, etc. So I think the decision for now is, do members accept the fact that we don't have a bund around the entire site, and then we just go with this hedgerow proposed, which is outside the site, but something that we could condition and is set out on page 96 of your papers. I think that's the decision tonight.
Then why are you saying I can't say no to the north and western because we don't know what the results of the acoustic survey is, but then you're saying we're going to put a hedge in because I know damn well that an acoustic, this is going to solve the problem, let's put a hedge in. So how can you be right and what I'm suggesting is no, don't do it?
No, I'm just to clarify, one is to deal with noise, one, the hedge is to deal with landscape mitigation. Well, that's to screen the extent of the operational works. I think that's where we're looking at. The acoustic thing is to deal with noise directly to protect the objector. The hedge is not to deal with noise issues. The hedge is to deal with landscape mitigation, because Councillor Harwood's motion at the last thing was to put a bund which would assist potentially with noise, but there's, the bund would be relatively small, so it's not really going to stop noise from an HGV coming out. The main thing was to mitigate the impact in landscape terms of the hard standing. Just to clarify, there were two different points. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Right, Councillor Mackay, then Councillor Springett.
I get the feeling we're being made fools of here. Back in October, we were asked to make a retrospective decision on something that's already taken place on Newnham Court. And quite rightly, Mr. Cook came here and said, this has been in place, this is greatly impacts upon my quality of life. So we make a decision, we say, well, we can do this. Then almost immediately, Newnham Court come back and say, yeah, well, actually, I've only told you half the story. I built a concrete slab, and there's going to be a concrete apron about the same size we've agreed to build. We've agreed with KCC to build. You know, it smells, you know, we're going to bloody do what we like. Yeah, well, I mean, this isn't a new road. Newnham Court must have known about this a year ago. You don't design and get permission to build a road, even on private land, in a couple of weeks, do you? You know, we've just been taken for mugs. Absolute mugs. I mean, a hedgerow, yeah, I mean, maybe Mr. Cook won't see the worst of the development. But he came here objecting on the grounds of noise. So, Mr. Officer, can you come back and say what conditions we can impose to reduce noise from this excessive development, or this development?
Bailey? Yep.
So just to clarify, in terms of, there's been an established lawful development certificate granted for the use of the land for the turning of HGV. So the use is established. Obviously, the operational works, i.e. the hard standing, is not, and that's why we've got an application for the operational works. So if we move on from that, what members agreed last time is there was a management plan proposed to look at how you look at mitigating the noise from HGVs and reversing vehicles. Members wanted to go further than that, and actually added to that management plan was also an acoustic survey, and that was principally on the basis of what the objector said. So what would happen coming forward is that within 4 months, the applicant would have to submit an acoustic survey as part of the management plan, which would have to demonstrate and take account of the noise of the operation of this site. If that acoustic survey then demonstrated that the noise was sufficient to cause a harm, and there are ranges that they'd have to look at in terms of what that harm would be, if that substantiated that, they'd have to come up with a design and detail for an acoustic fence in a location which would mitigate that impact to the neighbour, and that would have to come forward as part of the condition. So in terms of noise issues, I do think, as advising members, that condition 1IB does seek to address that, and if the acoustic survey demonstrated an issue, then the condition requires an acoustic fence to be provided, and we would have to agree that. So I think the noise matter is dealt with by the condition in terms of the impact on the neighbour. In terms of the hedge, which we're moving to, I am saying that the hedge is not to deal with noise issue. It's not a mitigation of noise. It is really an issue of providing some mitigation to that rather stark, hard standing area. But members will have to acknowledge that this is an allocated site, and this whole area is allocated under RX1 of the local plan for the Newnham Court shopping village, which is allowed to expand under the terms of that policy. So I think that's it. Members just need to consider whether they still wish to have the condition they imposed, and is that reasonable? But I will add that this plan in front of you here is not approved by KCC at this time. This is awaiting determination. The plan in this red outline here is awaiting determination of the current application. Once this application is determined, KCC have informed us that they'll then move forward and determine this application. So I did hear someone say it's not a fait accompli that this will get granted planning permission. You may think that may be the case, but we can't predetermine a decision making of an alternative authority. So members need to make the decision based on the merits of this scheme. And what I've done tonight is given you some background information about other schemes that are sitting, that are material, but we can't predetermine the application. Does that provide some response?
Wearing me down here. Very quick one. You said that after a survey, you would have to agree to the fencing, acoustic, if it resulted in acoustic fencing being required, yes? Would Maidstone Borough Council be in a position to insist that Newnham Court erected such a fence? It's all very well you agreeing to it, but putting it in...
I think if the survey information demonstrated harm, then the condition requires that that fence would be put in. You're asking a planner, Councillor. I could never answer. The issue is that there is you need the evidence in order to impose it. It'd be unreasonable for us to say that there is an impact when we don't have the evidence to conclude that. So the whole point of the survey is to provide that evidence, and then we'll come forward with the mitigation.
Yes, it's in the condition. The condition says, the acoustic barrier shall be provided in accordance with the agreed timetable and retained in accordance with the approved details. So if on the condition as written, yes, submit an acoustic report, it's assessed, it's identified what the barrier is, and it's implemented. That's what the condition says. Well, there you are. It's in the condition, Councillor Mackay.
Have some order, please, gentlemen. Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Mr. Kaya. Has that been Councillor Mackay?
Mix-up of interpretation.
Yes, mix-up interpretation. I did have Councillor Springer and then Councillor English and Councillor Harwood. Councillor Springer?
Thank you. I've just got a couple of questions. First one is, I presume the operational hours of this loading, unloading area are not within our remit? Or can we impose some limit, as in, can we impose any limit on when the beepers might be beeping, is my first question. And then the second question is, do we have any, I presume we can't impose a condition, but could we perhaps apply an informative that asks for the, dare I say, the hissing type of beeper, the one that drives my dog mad when Tesco's reverses up my drive, versus the beep type beeper? Do we have any, is there any way we could put an informative on to encourage the use of slightly less intrusive reversing warnings?
Mr. Bailey?
That noise that drives my dog absolutely mad.
For the sake of Mr. Mackay, the answer to that question is no. For the sake of brevity, but I will say, because we're not looking at the use of the site, we're looking at just the operational hard standing that was created. Should you retain it or should we not? But I would add that, again, if we get back to the acoustic survey, if that demonstrates, then the acoustic fence should deal with that, because it will have to take into account all the range of noises that will come. And they're going to have lorries turning up there to do it. They're going to have beepers. You're going to have all the sorts of range of activities you expect that service yard to have when they do the acoustic survey. Submit that to us, and if it proves harm, then it's going to be required to be provided. And I think we'd get into very difficult enforcement matters. Not only you couldn't impose it, but where's the noise coming from, who's doing it, who's doing that. So I think the fence is the mitigating factor.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Right.
Sorry, yeah, sorry, just to make it maybe a little bit easier. James, on that B, can that be put as its own condition and not part of the management plan? So in other words, the plan might deal with the measures and all that sort of thing, but as a separate condition, the acoustic survey is done. It's not associated with the plan at all. So you just say an acoustic survey, so you can say within 4 months or whatever, but it's its own condition and not associated with the plan. Because what you've got is you've got the acoustic survey, and then you've also got the landscaping all kind of mixed in together. Just wondering if we separated that out, and maybe if we asked for delegated authority for that, to make sure that that's... Yeah, it's just, basically it's just making sure I don't want to say to satisfy Councillor Mackay, I don't mean it the way it sounds, but but if we just pull that out, or look at ways of making it more robust, but it achieves the objective, but just not as part of a plan, but rather as its own acoustic survey, as a separate condition.
I'm not saying you couldn't, if that's where members want to go. It's just the issue. The reasons why it was put in there is because you've got to look at the management plan, which sets out, it's looking at measures to reduce potential noise disturbance to neighbours, including the timings. So it's kind of layered within that proposal. But if members wish to separate it, I would ask for delegated authority that be separated to make sure it works in relation to the other conditions. Because as it's retrospective, we need the structure of this condition. Because obviously if you see later down the line, if it's not provided, then you've got the catch-all mechanism that the permission falls away. So it would still need to have that hook because it's a retrospective permission, hence that's why it's linked in with all the others. So, yeah. You've just made me think. You've just made me think now on the basis. Personally, I think it's okay as it is. But if we ask for delegated powers, just to make sure I think that over, just to see how that works, because I wouldn't want the hook to be lost and the permission lost if they're not providing it on that basis. So, yeah.
Does that satisfy you, Mr. Fitzpatrick?
Yeah. It's just, I think the greater the flexibility, the better, so long as we achieve this wall somehow.
Thank you very much. All Councillor English?
I think I'm losing the will to live. Bottom line is, what would happen if we decided, yes, we do want to keep the original bund. I mean, didn't you just start by saying we can't? So why are we being asked to reaffirm whether or not we want to keep it? Because didn't the planning officer basically say we can't achieve that? So I'm not quite sure why we've just spent half an hour discussing a point. And secondly, in terms of the acoustic survey, well, we haven't got the acoustic survey, so we don't know what it's going to tell us. So this entire discussion, as far as I can see, without trying to sound as bad-tempered as one or two other people have sounded, has been a bit sort of pointless, really, because no one can tell us anything about what we actually need to put on the site or what we can actually achieve. So I'm not really sure why we're even talking about it, because we can't really determine anything. Bottom line is, if we said now, yeah, we keep the original condition, what would be the effect?
Mr. Bailey?
I suspect, and I don't know, I suspect the applicant would appeal on the basis and say, is it reasonable to impose that condition given the context of the site, etc., in the Newnham Court shopping area, which is an allocated shopping allocation in the local plan. I suspect that's where they would go. I suppose we're at the option, is the condition reasonable? You've got to sort of look at the test of reasonableness. Is it relevant, necessary, directly related to planning? All those other things. The applicant has given sort of a justification as to why the bunding is not considered reasonable in that extent, both to the east, south and west. But, you know, I'm here to advise members on that basis and provide a wider picture here. So I don't probably disagree with you, Councillor English, on that basis. The opposite view is it's not reasonable to impose that condition in its entirety, but to amend it to include the landscaping to the north.
Okay, before before I call on Mr. Harwood, I just need to interject and say it's getting near 10:30. Are members happy to carry on beyond 10:30? I think we need to get this finished. But you are, I need a resolution that you're actually happy to carry on. Right, fine, good stuff. Right, Councillor Harwood.
Right. I've got to say, in terms of the principle here, this is a major civil engineering works where we've got one application which has been kind of put on a back burner because the applicant was effectively speaking not to the landowner but to someone on an adjoining piece of land about what goes on the landowner's land. And now we've got an application where we had a retrospective concrete laid between a residential dwelling house and a hospital when any of that commercial site could have been used for the noisiest, most bad neighbour part of the development, but through at a fait accompli, they've already put it in the most sensitive part of their landholding. And now we get, we're going to have this big road, you talk about SB17, in the foreground of the Kent Downs AONB with no landscaping, and another concrete apron attached to it. So it's becoming a very industrialised site between the hospital and the dwelling house in the foreground of the AONB. And we're finding out about this, and you are, as the senior planning officers, in dribs and drabs. I mean, it's no way to run a whelk store, is it? I think there's a really, some significant issues here that need to be bottomed out about the conduct of this major civil engineering works in a very sensitive part of the town. That we're not doing this the right way around. We're being offered a fait accompli that it's in a bad neighbour site, but none of these issues were discussed at the strategic planning meetings or anywhere else. They just suddenly seem to be appearing. And we're finding out through these planning applications, this convoluted drainage scheme on our land by the crematorium, now this one. And I think a number of the speakers here are absolutely right that should we dignify this by making determinations at this point, should we not see an overall scheme with an overall landscaping scheme with overall protection for Newnham Court and for the Kim's Hospital? So we're actually looking at this not in, we get one little application in isolation, but then suddenly we find out we're going to have it doubled in size and a damn great access road going up there so that we're going to have more lorries and more delivery. I'm just finding it very difficult, and I would like Mr. Bailey's kind of advice on this as to the best way that we can restore some order over this process so that we're not always basically playing catch up and not really in a position to influence anything. Because clearly, if you're going to introduce effectively a non-conforming use into a sensitive location, you would say there was potentially harm here. Have you considered other locations in a kind of sequential approach? And then if you cannot put them in a less sensitive location, you could then look at the mitigation. But we're being told, now the concrete platform's there, you can't get any mitigation in between them and the hospital on one side and the house on the other. But as you say, the blue line is massive. It's a massive commercial centre. So I'm struggling with this and what we're being asked to do as a committee this evening.
Mr. Bailey, do you want to come back on that? I can see where Councillor Holwood's coming from.
the reality is I wasn't aware of the wider picture going on this site in terms of the access road. Obviously, as I say, this road has been permitted by KCC already, so that is an approved scheme. This one is awaiting determination. We can't influence the decision of an adjoining authority, and members could lobby as part of this. I suppose if they were minded to approve this application, there could be a subsequent amendment as part of this committee to say that members have permitted this scheme, but notwithstanding that, they would expect to see any decision determined by KCC on the new road to have significant landscaping scheme around that, and that would be something that would be coming from this planning committee, which could then be sent to KCC. So that is an option how members of this committee could put their views to KCC on the determination of an application that hasn't come forward, which would be this application. But to answer the question directly, members have only got control over this small site here. Well, that's because this is the Highways Authority, and they've got separate powers as the Highways Authority to do strategic work network. So unfortunately, that's the way the planning system works. KCC have authority for doing roadworks. I can't explain why this came through a lawful development certificate and why this wasn't included in the application. All I know is that the agent for this site submitted the lawful development certificate, which was assessed by this council and was considered that it had been used lawfully for 10 years. So MBC granted the use of the land of this area on the basis of information that KCC provided. So the use has gone, in effect, that was granted. We're now just considering the operational work. So it is difficult, and I can understand members' concern that you're being asked to assess an application in isolation. I cannot explain why KCC have done what they have done and tried to sort of segregate it. In my view, I personally might have come forward or would have advised that the whole thing comes forward as an application. I don't know why it didn't, and I can't explain to members why it's gone the route that it has, but we're now at the decision stage now. Members know the slightly wider picture. There is an opportunity to possibly influence that with a separate resolution on strategic landscaping as part of that application. That's at the remit, but if you're asking me in terms of what my officer view is, in terms of the tests, applying, is it reasonable, necessary, relevant, to apply a landscaping bund around the entire site, I think my view comes down on the basis of what's in the report, on the basis that I don't think that that's reasonable to impose that now, and there is additional mitigation that's being proposed to the north, and I think that's where I sit. It's a difficult decision for members, I understand that, and I'm not going to endorse the way it's been done, but at the end of the day, we have to make a decision, or this committee have to make a decision on this application moving forward, and it's either go with the original recommendation, go with the current recommendation, or else members are going to have an option to defer it, but defer it on what information? KCC are clear that they won't determine this application until this one has been determined. That's the position we're at.
Thank you, Councillor. Mr. Bailey. Councillor Cock.
I very much want to make sense of this, and it is a struggle. In 1B, it says about the acoustic survey, which will demonstrate what the problems are, whatever they're going to be. I don't think we should be asked to look at anything to do with this until we've seen that, because we could be asked saying, put some trees in here and landscaping to the north, yet then they go and put a fence in front of it, and we've just wasted the applicant's time and money. So therefore, I think we should be saying, we don't want to pass this until we've seen the survey done. They've got 4 months, must be less a month. So 3 months until they've got to do it. So I think we should defer until we've seen that, and we can make a structured, evaluated, evidence-based decision.
Would you like to come back on that, Mr. Bailey?
The difficulty with that is that members had previously considered the use of the condition acceptable by condition. So I'm just saying that members previously had considered that the use of that wording in that condition would have been acceptable in terms of what they previously agreed. I appreciate the fact that we're coming back to you because principally the use of this bund around the entire site, that was the principal concern. But if you're then changing the goalpost in terms of where you were previously, you know, that could be considered to be unreasonable. But I would also add that this is a standard way of dealing with mitigation of this ilk, because it does require 4 months to come forward. You've still got to go through the process. This still has to go through a KCC assessment proposal. It's still got to go to their committees to be agreed. So in terms of 4 months, you're going to have all this information coming forward before I would suggest this element is going to be anywhere near an approval stage, if that's where it's going to head to. So personally, my view is I think it's reasonable to stick with the grounds, but it's obviously I'm here to advise members. It's down to members on this day. I think it should stay as it is on the ground B, requiring that to come forward within 4 months.
Thank you, Mr.
We're in a
Bailey.
chicken and egg situation that otherwise we'll go pinging, bonging backwards and forwards.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Bailey. That's a very lucid explanation. I mean, the difficulty is we have KCC, the Highway Authority. We are the planning authority. There's already the lawful development certificate, which compromises the land for the use. And we are in a very, very difficult situation. Can I call upon Councillor Springer and then Councillor English?
Yeah, I'll be very quick. This is probably a bit non-standard for a planning committee. Can we, as a council, please write to KCC and say, can you please tell us what your master plan is? And can you please not just do things without considering landscaping? Is there any way we can write to them and say, oi, we're not happy with what you've done because there's no consideration of impact on the AONB? Are we able to do that? Can we ask SPI to do that? It's our policy, it's our local plan, our RMX whatever policy, and they are riding roughshod over it.
Thank you, Councillor Springer. Can I just ask Councillor, sorry, keep giving you Councillor, Mr. Bailey, presumably KCC will have consulted the Borough Council on that application for that new roadway?
No, I couldn't see any reference for a consultation. It's slightly different from a Regulation 3 application, which is where KCC would consult, have a statutory duty to consult. But in terms of the Highways Authority, they have different powers. So I just got to remember, this isn't KCC corporate, this is KCC Highways Authority. Okay. But to answer that question, you have the opportunity tonight to have a second resolution, which could be separate to this, setting out your concerns with the way that the application has been progressed as a planning committee, and that you felt it's difficult to determine an application in isolation. Why didn't it come forward as a holistic application in line with that application? And you could also say that you consider that when members determine that application, serious consideration needs to be given to strategic landscaping on that new road area in line, because it's in the foreground of the AONB. And I think that could come from this planning committee as a separate resolution, not part of this decision. And that means it doesn't need to come from the leader, it's coming from this group. Yep. And then that would be the resolution, if that's what you had agreed.
I think we're moving towards that way. Councillor English.
Yeah, I would just point out this is about the 27th time this has happened. We all remember what KCC did in relation to a site not far away in relation to a free school, where there was a lot of consultation went on with the Parish Council or Maidstone Borough Council or anyone else in that respect. None at all. So let's not pretend this is an isolated incident. It's not. It's the County Council's established method of proceeding. It's not just the Highways Department, it's practically every flipping department of the County Council. It happens all the time. So let's not pretend it's new or surprising. It isn't. It's standard practice. The fact is, though, that we have only one decision to make tonight whether or not to restate our original decision on the condition, because we cannot defer. I'm sorry, we can't defer waiting for the acoustic survey. I'd love to, I really would. I'd proposed it myself. All that will happen in that case is there'll be an appeal for non-determination. Well, maybe it's not. Maybe so, maybe not. But frankly, we don't, you know, it's not the right thing to do to provoke an appeal for non-determination, regardless of the fact of how long it will take or not. Because that is going to be an unnecessary process which will cost the council time and money and will get us absolutely nowhere. The only question we have, and we don't need to do it, because the condition on the acoustic report will flow from what the report says. What we need to decide is what we're going to do about the condition we were going to impose and are now told it's unreasonable to impose. And that is not going to be influenced by the acoustic report, because we know there's going to be, well, we probably suspect there's going to be an issue, but we will have to determine that decision on the basis of whether or not we believe it to be reasonable or not to stick with that original condition. And otherwise, we're just going around in circles, and we're wasting an awful lot of time and effort on something we cannot influence until we know the results of. That's the only thing we can determine now.
Thank you, Councillor English. I'd like to
That's what I'm asking. What have we been given to change our mind?
Thank you, Councillor English. I'd like to try and bring things to a conclusion. We did have a proposal from Councillor Cox for a deferment. I think that was seconded by Councillor Mumford. But I didn't quite hear or can't recall.
What have we been given to make us change our mind? What evidence have we been shown? What statistics? What facts? Nothing. You've just told us to put some planting on the northern edge of what you're showing us there. I don't see it. And in a minute, I'm just going to leave and let you all decide it. In fact, I think the chairman should decide it.
Councillor Harwood.
Thank you. Please, could we have the aerial photograph, which actually shows the application site with the temporary buildings behind it and the concrete platform? So, why can an earth bund, which has both a landscape and some noise mitigation value in a kind of half-moon sea, not be imposed on that, particularly on the northern edge, but curving round? Because Newnham Court is here, Kim's is there. Why can't they put an arc of to deflect any noise back into their commercial centre? What is the practical barrier to creating a bund? It seems to me like there's a perfectly good grassy area on there. You could build up an earth mound, you could put the hedge on it, and the concrete and even their new apron would still be in place and it wouldn't impinge on it. I'm not sure what the barrier is. I mean, perhaps we're taking this too literally, that we're saying we have an earth bund all the way around, because if it was an earth bund all the way around, you wouldn't be able to get into it to turn around, would you, unless you were in a monster truck with big wheels. So I'm just trying to be, reasonable and practical in that we know the two locations that are most sensitive. It's the two premises, which are both roughly to the north, one's to the north-east, one's to the northwest, and the AOMB immediately to the north. So therefore, a crescent bund on that grassed area to the north would seem to do the job. But why is it impossible?
I don't think, James, I think the issue there is the way the condition is that to put an earth bund all the way around. That's what the condition says. The condition doesn't say put a half-crest moon at the top end of it. And that's the condition. It's the condition.
In terms of the issue, I don't think the issue of the bund along the northeastern boundary here would be the issue. But let's not forget that if you put a half crescent bund around here, then obviously you can see it cuts into the area that's been used down here. So the applicant is going to turn around to say that's unreasonable. If you constructed your argument that you wanted a bund, not just a staggered hedgerow along this area along the front, well, we've only got control of this area, but you turned it around and said you want a bund, planted bund along this northeastern boundary, then the reality is that I think would suffice, because it still allows, you know, it still allows whatever may come forward for this area, and allows whatever, if that application is approved, to come round and up here. So
Seems like an Emily.
no, I'm well, as I said, the only way you'd be putting it outside the red line boundary, which I don't think in principle is unacceptable, because we've now established that it's there, but I do think that you could only really put the bund along this northeastern top boundary. So what, this one? Well, because you've got that. So that you've got that, that's the plan on form. So that's what you've got on site. You put a bund around here, then the reality is you've got a hard surface there, you'll get washover of the bund over this area. That, putting it down on that boundary is not really, and notwithstanding that, you've got the mitigation from the acoustic fence that would deal with that issue. And then you've got to say, is it reasonable to put, what is that seeking to do, that bund? So I go back to my original reasoning that I think it would be fine to put a bund along this area instead of where they're showing the staggered hedgerow, or put the hedgerow on top of the bund, but I do not think that it would be reasonable to put the bund going down this boundary down here. It would create all sorts of issues down this area of the site, and I don't think that's going to work. You'd have to dig up the hard standing area to do it, so there wasn't... Well, I'm just posing the issues in terms of where members are. So I think where I finish is the bund across there is reasonable, if that's where members wish to go.
Where's Mr. Cook's property? It's to the north of this, not just to that side. That's King's. To the top of that.
Yeah, but the acoustic fence deals with that, Councillor Round.
With the acoustic fence, we don't know where it's going to go. He's here, isn't he?
Yeah.
So we need to protect that.
But it's like it's likely that the acoustic fence deals with proximity to the nearest noise-sensitive noise source, and it's the residential property is the noise-sensitive. So the acoustic fence will be looking at mitigating the impacts on the objector. So in my personal professional view, the acoustic fence would deal with the noise on this property. So the bund is not there in reality to deal with noise. It's to deal with the mitigation on landscape. And I'll say that, you know, I do not think, the reality is if you're trying to put a bund to mitigate noise, I don't think that's the appropriate way to deal with it.
I'm conscious of time. Councillor Harwood, do you want to put forward a...
Okay.
So is that a proposal?
Okay, I think that's reasonable.
Is that seconded? So, Councillor Mackay, do you want to say something? You're too slow, I'm afraid. It's Councillor English.
Could we add that second recommendation about writing to them? Yeah.
Yes, yes. Right, okay.
Chairman, can I please just confirm where this bund and the hedgerow is going?
It is going along.
Right, so...
Sorry, can I suggest that a slightly better approach than a hedge in glorious isolation perched on the top is that the earth bund is planted. So we're planting the whole earth bund with shrubs, and then they will shelter each other, they'll grow better, and we take that. So rather than, so we're not perching a hedge on a bund, we're planting a bund. Thank you.
Right. Okay, we can secure that by condition, Councillor Harwood. So it's been proposed by Councillor Harwood. Sorry, Councillor Bryn.
I'm sorry, sorry about that. About 25 past 10, I wrote on my paper, realign the bund. And if you look at that top building, that the three-lined one, thank you, James, that's going to be moved anyway. So what's to stop us asking for a bund to go from the corner, the top left-hand corner of that building, right the way along to the other side of the new proposed, not approved yet road?
They are. That's where the green line is on the
Is that where that is? And the other thing I was going to say is these plans are not new. If you squint and look at them, the first date on here is April. And I went to a presentation at a hotel when they first muted the changes to Junction 7, and it was all on there then. So why are we only hearing about this now? I go back to what was said earlier.
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, a procedural motion is going to be to the vote.
Yes, certainly. Okay, can I please have votes in favour?
That's unanimous, Chairman.
Thank you. Thank you, members. That's hard work to get there. Sorry? Okay, and voting on the letter. Votes in favour? That's unanimous again. Thank you, members.
Sorry, on that, Chairman,
yeah.
the letter, are we referring to both of the planning applications we're currently dealing with, which frankly the wrong people were spoken to, we had incomplete things, no justification? Yes. I think it's not just about this component.
Yeah, it's everything. It's everything on the Kim site, isn't it? Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Make sure that new road, which will go to their committee, has strategic landscaping. I mean, that's the key thing that I would suggest you want to get across, that when they're making that decision, they need to take into account it's in the foreground of the A and B, and the advice of this committee is it should have strategic landscaping.
And
thank you, Mr. Bailey. Right.
Can I just say, and it's not only that bit that's there, it's the bit that goes down to the road that comes off Kim's that I've momentarily, because I'm so tired, forgotten.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Thank you, members. Councillor Mumford.
So we finish the meeting. Can I propose that we accept the appeal decision report as read?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Absolutely. Right, I therefore close the meeting. Thank you very much, members. It's been hard work.